each other, so probably you don't know me, so I will introduce myself a little bit first. My name is Artemis, and I'm a colleague of Katerina and Kostas at the University of Crete. And as I was explaining to Professor Bourazelis in the beginning, I'm actually a prehistorian. But I got into this moderating mess because I thought I complimented the organizers on their idea, on the format of the meeting. And I was very enthusiastic about it. So Kostas said, how about, moderating in a panel discussion or something? So this is how it happened. But without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, which is Professor Gunnar Seelentag, with a beautiful name, who is, I'm sure he would love the opportunity to visit Crete, because Crete seems to be one of his research interests. And we're so sorry for this, but I do hope that the organizers will find an opportunity to make it up to you, the speakers, and all invited people. So without further ado, Professor Seelentag, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm honored and very glad to be included in this illustrious circle of colleagues. And without further ado, I would like to start my presentation. So I have a handout which you can download if you haven't done so already. It gives you an overview over the key concepts and some definitions, and it gives you the opportunity to follow along my rather fast train of thoughts, which I'm going to be driving there. So, dear colleagues and dear Professor Davies, this presentation originates from my efforts to understand the emergence and development of social and political institutions in the 7th to 5th centuries BC, and what role dynamics of competition and cooperation played in the process. So often in scholarship, the view is expressed that increasing societal complexity produces institutions with somewhat evolutionary inevitability, but societies do not become more complex only by growing larger, nor as they grow larger, they invariably become more complex. Instead, human agents need to consciously invest their resources by which a community is kept unified and integrated. Resources like material goods or time, combat power, or the activation of social ties. Now, my endeavor is to understand institutional change from the perspective of model actors, to reconstruct their interests and scope for action, as well as the dynamics of their group formation. And I'm interested in what motives they might have had to not only invest in the context of the polis, but also to further the polis. For this purpose, I would like to build a model of socio-political dynamics or not only in archaic Greece, that might have the potential to explain various manifestations of institutionalization in quite different social fields, and hopefully we'll be able to integrate different genres of literary and epigraphic sources with archaeological evidence. I would like to show that prominent traits of archaic and classical Greece can be described and analyzed together as manifestations of a strategic containment of competition and safeguarding of cooperation by institutions, a dynamic that I describe as cartel formation or cartelization. For me, that means that the key actors limited parts of their competitive behavior to secure their own socio-political primacy and to exercise power under controlled conditions as a collective over those excluded from this group. In the footsteps of Jakob Burckhardt, we used to see agonality as a characteristic trait of the Greeks. And more recently, however, the use of competition in ancient studies has been critically questioned for the Greek world, notably by Hans and our Austrian colleague Christoph Ulf. A model developed by sociologist Georg Simmel at the beginning of the 20th century has proven to be useful, I believe. Simmel argues that competition is not a natural striving of the individual for superiority, not a constant antagonism between individuals. Rather, competition is a means to create social connections. And to illustrate this, Simmel distinguishes conflict and competition as different categories of rivalry. So in conflict, there is no prize of victory outside the confrontation. Victory lies in the defeat of the opponent. in competition, the prize is not in the hands of the competitors themselves. Instead, the competitors are aiming in parallel, for example, to win the profit, and victory over the opponent is only a means to win the prize. This prize amounts to the favor of one or many persons outside the competitors themselves, the so-called third party. Simmel's competition even shows a socializing effect because striving for the favor of the third party might incent competitors to maximize their bonds with it. In this context, processes of cartel formation or cartelization can be defined as a pattern of action whereby rivals build alliances in social systems which are characterized by competition. Now, it is important to state that competition is not waived altogether in cartelization. Rather, a number of competitors agree to forego certain practices of their competition in certain socio-political spaces. By doing so, they can save those resources they would otherwise have to invest in competition. And now the cartel will grant its members, and even or especially the ones from the second row, monopoly profits. That means profits which result only from their coalition building and which they would not have gained in the free interplay of forces. Since competitive practices are largely favoring a third party in the case of cartel formation, it is this third party that will bear the losses of the absence of competitive practices. And metaphorically speaking, cartel members might agree within their circle on offering metaphorical goods of a certain quality not below a certain price, and competitors from outside might be kept at bay or be integrated in the cartel. So overall, with processes of cartel formation, we are observing an institutionalization of cooperation. With competition and cartel, Simmel had formulated ideas that later and independently became integral parts of game theory, which models decision-making situations in which participants influence each other with their respective decisions. It states that under appropriate conditions, it can be strategically meaningful for individuals to engage in actions that, in their own perception, are less good than others. For the individual actor, it would be the best result if the opponent played according to the rules, but he himself could violate them without being sanctioned. The worst result, of course, would be if he himself cooperated, but the other would violate the rules and prevail. Now, in between, there are two possibilities. Either both violate the rules, then a conflict could arise with costly consequences for both, or both parties stick to the rules, they cooperate under controlled conditions, and both get a result that is worse than the optimal one for each of them, but better than the worst. So in this scenario, cooperation will be fostered by reputational effects. The reputation of an actor to be reliable supports an opponent in his decision to be predisposed rather towards cooperation than towards defection. Of course, only in repeated scenarios without a set time limit do players develop an interest in their being regarded as cooperative players, and they are more likely to act accordingly. So the socio-political scenarios of archaic and classical Greek communities were home to such conditions. They were not limited in time and thus offered a potentially unlimited number of decision-making situations. And so the actors in the polis or the ethne faced the options that uncompromising rivalry could deliver better individual results. There was large gain in non-cooperative conflict of all against all, at least in the short term. But success was incalculable, and chances were you'd end up a loser, and quite possibly permanently. On the other hand, cooperation in a cartel promised better collective outcomes, and in the longer term. Here, the perspective was for competitors to make a limited but steady and rather calculable profit under conditions safeguarded by institutions. And this ends my tiresome survey of the basic building blocks of cartelization. For the following attempt to illustrate and exemplify the mechanisms of cartelization, primarily in archaic Greece, there is one supposition: that we are dealing with strategically thinking and acting agents whose main goal was to secure their participation in various contexts in the best way possible, given the circumstances. And this was not easy. For the 7th and 6th centuries, we could envisage a society in which the group of those who considered themselves as potentially capable and entitled to hold institutionalized roles of prominence was quite large. I suppose it comprised the heads of those households that owned at least a team of oxen and employed laborers, both free and unfree, to work their land. Comparative evidence suggests they might be quantified at between 15 and 25% of all households, and among them were those individuals whom the epics call basileis, but those were not, so to speak, of a different category. All these households together, with a greater number of oikoi who held land but did not own a team of oxen, which put them in a position of structural dependency, alongside specialist workers, made up, I believe, what our sources call the demos. All this resulted, on the one hand, in a relative homogeneity of the group of leading actors, which would facilitate the formation of an ideology of equality among them. And on the other hand, it led to an instability of an elite, because social mobility was always possible, both downwards and upwards. Therefore, elite status was not perceived as, and was not, irrevocably exclusive. So the first essential characteristic to our model of cartelization is the socio-political mobility of the time. It prevented any hard criteria, such as the noble blood, which would identify an individual clearly and from the outset as a member of the group of leading agents. Rather, access to the archaic elites came through recognition of one's peers and one's social inferiors to belong to this group. And this recognition very much resulted from a successful performance of specific practices displaying aristeia, which all required wealth. Therefore, the criteria for the integration of some members into the cartel and the exclusion of others were fluid and always controversial. This conflictual fluidity can be illustrated by Theognis' complaints about social mobility and his own marginalization through betrayal, or what he calls poverty, and new members of the community's elite. The poet tries to counter these changes by ideologizing birth and inherent goodness, which he claims for himself. And I quote Theognis, "We seek out rams and asses and horses that are purebred, Kurnos, and everyone wishes that they mount females of good stock. But a noble man does not mind marrying the base daughter of a base father if the latter gives him riches. Wealth has mixed up the blood." And another citation, "Fortune gives even an utterly wicked man riches, Kurnos, but excellence, Arete, is allotted to a few as their companion." So here we might see the attempt to define supposedly hard and inalienable factors as the key criteria for belonging to the group of dominant actors. And similarly, the complaints of Alcaius can be understood that a familial tradition, what he claims to be a familial tradition of, and maybe a birthright to, prominent participation in the polis was taken from him when he had to flee his hometown. And I quote, "I long to hear the assembly being summoned and the council, the property in possession of which my father and my father's father have grown old among these mutually destructive citizens." Let's move on to the second characteristic of cartel formation. Because of the rather broad social base of relevance, political agents and their social mobility, the lack of hard criteria of privileged participation, and the non-existing demarcation between elite and demos, the cartel of competitors for influence and primacy in the polis not only failed to accommodate all potential stakeholders, it could not come up with clear-cut boundaries. Thus, the foremost aspiration of an agathos was to secure his own position in the group of those who actually received rents and monopoly profits. And that meant working towards keeping the circle of cartel members to such a size that he himself belonged to it without fear of dropping out, yet to close the circle fairly soon after himself, so that his own stake in the collective good would not be smaller than necessary. But it was also about making the cartel so large that no competing cartels would successfully arise in competition to his own. In drafting a model which puts strategic individuals at its center, these seem to be, to me, the essential dynamics of group and community formation. An example of these dynamics is the marginalization of most of the Achaean basileis before Troy. They are all leaders of their own contingents and firmly established in their respective homelands. However, in the new community of the Achaean camp, only 9 belong to the small council of the leading decision makers, like Agamemnon and Odysseus, Nestor and Diomedes. Nireus of Zyme, for example, himself a leader of men, was not a member of the small council, for he was, as the epos says, a weakling, and only a few men followed with him. So these dynamics in the Achaean camp seem to reflect a scenario of community formation, as several settlement communities came together and thus challenged the local structures of leadership and participation as new hierarchies were established, some men finding their way into this new group of leading agents and others being marginalized in the process. If we want to look at socio-political dynamics in archaic Greece from the perspective of individuals who principally seek to secure their own participation to the best possible conditions under the circumstances given, we must ask what factors might have induced such individuals to cooperate. An important incentive for cooperation and cartelization lies in the actor's strategic interest to meet pressure from outside, which would affect not only himself, but a larger number of alike individuals. And this is the third characteristic of cartelization. That such pressure could promote group cohesion and shape institutions can be seen in the Iliad. For example, it is only after Achilles drew back and under the pressure of the now successfully assaulting Trojans that the Achaean camp is reorganized in Phyla and Phretrae, that walls are built and procedures of decision-making are further developed. And closely related to this is the fourth characteristic, the interest of cartel members to calm internal conflicts. The position of the individual as well as the position of the group within the community as a whole is destabilized by redistributions of the collective profits. Such disturbances of the balance of cooperation cause unrest and violence among the group members and weaken their ability to generate monopoly profits. The Iliad makes it clear that intra-elite conflicts, such as the one between the gods or the one between Agamemnon and Achilles, weaken the entire community. And that is why I believe Odysseus warns against polykoirania in the second book of the Iliad and saves the day for Agamemnon, whose inadequacy in this situation is apparent. But it is necessary to support one leader, and they had agreed upon Agamemnon for the continuing cohesion of the leaders and the troops, and thus the success of the joint enterprise against Troy. Such challenges might instigate competitors to create mechanisms for organizing the group's internal structure, setting a distribution key for the rents they seek, and coming up with mechanisms to deter or sanction deviance. In short, to institutionalize their cooperation. The establishment of the Solonian classes, which staggered political participation according to economic substance, might be seen as such an attempt to curb internal conflict by creating concentric circles or degrees of cartel participation. In addition, the unrestricted extraction of that most attractive rent, which was the stable exercise of power by the elite, could possibly cause a deep social fault line, which could be leveled only with drastic measures. Solon's measures against enslavement for debt may reflect an attempt to deal with such internal pressure. And that introduces the fifth and perhaps most important characteristic. Ganz kleinen Moment, ich bin gerade am Reden, mein Schatz. Gehst du mal runter? Jetzt ist ganz schlecht. The fifth and most important characteristic of cartel formation. The individual's wish to control social inferiors and to profit from it. I find it plausible to conceptualize archaic elites as predatory coalitions for the common purpose of exploitation and rent seeking. That might sound crude at first and mafia-esque, which I quite like to imply following in the footsteps of Hans, but can be explained. A predatory coalition may seem legitimate to the socially inferiors if the rate of exploitation is controlled and if arbitrary expropriations by individuals or small groups are contained by peer pressure. Otherwise, the entire exploitation coalition might lose acceptance. And when I say social inferiors, I do not mean to imply that those formed an undifferentiated mass. Rather, they comprised a spectrum of statuses, and the idea that there was always one below yourself was essential to stabilizing those socio-political orders we are looking at here. Institutionalizing statuses within the community was a key tool. Excuse me just for 1 second. What was the coffee? Ich bin gerade am Reden. Nein, ganz kurz. Nachher. Stine, kannst du die Tino bitte abholen? Well, they were terribly well behaved, my children, over the day, but now is possibly the worst moment. Okay, I'm sorry. So, yes. So, the effort to control those social inferiors also arose out of the fear of their mobilization. There are numerous indications of the action potential of a dissatisfied demos already in the epics. In the Odyssey, this becomes clear, for example, in Penelope reproaching the ringleader of her suitors, Antinous, for his ingratitude, apparently forgetting the rescue of his father Eupetes at the hands of Odysseus. And I quote Penelope, "Do you not remember the time when your father came to this house a fugitive in terror of his people? For in very truth, they were greatly angry with him because he had joined Taphian pirates and harried the Thesprotians who were in league with us. Him then they meant to slay and take him from his life by violence and utterly devour his great and pleasant property. But Odysseus held them back and prevented them despite their eagerness." So one noteworthy thing here is that the demos seems to be permeated by shared ideas about what behavior of a leader is harmful to the peace and well-being of the community and how this deviance must be sanctioned. And this is done in a self-organized manner. The other remarkable thing is that Odysseus rescues a bad Basileus against his people's claims, which the epic calls legitimate. So I would express that in terms, he puts cartel solidarity over the welfare of the demos. But this potential of unrest seems to be the reason why cartel formation at the same time seems to be about integrating selected segments of those social inferiors into the political process under controlled conditions. For another factor why exploitation may seem legitimate to the exploited is when concessions are made to them. Such dynamics can be perceived in the earliest laws, as we already saw. In Cretan Dereros, the polis decided after having convened the Phylae. In Chios, there was the Bolle Demosiae, which had penal authority and was selected 50 men from each Phylae, and so on. I have given you an overview over some of the formulae in early laws on the handout. So often a broader base of political actors is explicitly involved in the legislative process, as might already emphasized. And in many polis, the supervision of public officials is entrusted to institutions that incorporate a wider group of community members. Already in the epics, the consultations and decisions of the Basileus took place before the public. The demos was always necessary to witness and approve the decisions relevant to the community. So it might not have been too big a step to institutionalize the witness role and then the consent of the demos, to make the assembly a necessary procedural element alongside the consensual decision-making of the leaders in order to make decisions more binding. There was always the risk that leaders whose preferences were not met by a certain decision ultimately would not back it. And here the demos served as an authority outside the circle of the immediate decision makers. The social control of the decision was put on a broader basis and thereby made more sustainable. The sixth trait of cartel formations in archaic Greece was their instability. Again and again, the sources attest to scenarios in which cartelization was undertaken, but the alliances formed were by no means stable. Examples for that would be the changing coalitions of different hetairai in the stasis songs of Archaios, and Theognis offers similar thoughts, lamenting about the lack of reliability and opacity of his opponents. Of course, he also advises to behave principally and preventively in just as treacherous a manner, and I quote, "And those who were noble before Estloi are now base, dailoi. They deceive one another and mock one another, knowing neither the distinctive marks of the base nor those of the noble. Make none of these townsmen your sincere friend, Polypaides, because of any need. Seem in speech to be friend of everyone, but share with no one any serious matter whatsoever. As another example of the instability of cartel formations, one could adduce the numerous laws that try to establish duties for office holders to act in a certain way in reaction to certain scenarios defined by the law, and that call for fines, but not always, in the case of non-compliance. An example for that comes from 7th century tyrants. We saw that one already from one of the earliest laws we have, where it is said that the drinking leader, the platiboinarchoi, shall impose fines on the drinkers, the platiboinoi. In each case, if they do not punish them, they shall owe to the goddess Athena 30 medimnoi of grain, maybe. Laws like this one reflect a rupture of cartelization, namely cases of free riding, probably motivated by the unwillingness of an official to act against people close to him, motivated by the effort not to be prompted by the yet weak principle of institutional power to damage his own personal power by an unpopular act. However, this concrete and actually structural instability of cartel formation speaks neither against the existence of a socio-political pattern of action, which I call cartelization, nor against the value of this model as a heuristic tool. After all, we see that this pattern of action, despite all its apparent weaknesses for its contemporaries, was repeatedly employed as a mechanism of socio-political organization. You could say the inscribed rules of the 7th to 5th centuries and further attest to the normative side of cartel formation. Their existence reflects a notion or an ideal that the creation, improvement, and safeguarding of institutional power and thus cooperation can function, but also reflected is the awareness that again and again these rules will be violated. It might be the most important mechanism of a cartel formation to control the rate of exploitation by controlling those who are exploiting. So for the remainder of my talk, I would like to discuss some signs of elite cooperation as a cartel in archaic Greece. First, I will look at different social spaces and patterns of action in which and whereby cooperation was practiced, and then I will point out signs of the kind of ethical homogenization which was necessary for institutionalized cooperation. Of great relevance to practicing cooperation seems to me the numerous smaller units within and outside the greater community. They soften the notion that cooperation and cartel formation should have worked immediately on the grand scale of the entire community. These sub-communities shaped each individual's identity and defined his socio-political status in the eyes of others. Participation in these sub-communities did not necessarily supplement polis membership, but might have outweighed or quite possibly even stood against it. But overall, the network of various institutions across the polis, whose composition transcended the affiliations of the members to other partial sub-communities, certainly served as integrative organizations. Their members practiced cooperation and consensus in smaller circles, and here an actor's reputation was built up. An important indication of cooperation and the discursive reflection on it is provided by the many scenarios of delayed reciprocal action, which is the basis for consensus decisions. In those, a common gain within the group of relevant actors is achieved, albeit only in the course of time, with repeated instances of compromise by the different parties involved. And this becomes clear, for example, in the consensual decision at the beginning of the 4th book of the Iliad. Here Zeus gives in to Hera's situational strong preference to destroy Troy, but he formulates his expected return in the future. She will have to consent to the destruction of settlements which he will want to destroy, however much she might love them. And Hera agrees, not without stating that now they both have yielded. Important here, as in similar scenes of the epic, is that yielding is possible without loss of face and status. Instead, it contributes to an actor's reputation of being a reliable partner. These socio-political spaces and their mechanisms of cooperation were nuclei of the ethical homogenization of the archaic elites. And with this term, I characterize the staged adaptation of a standardized lifestyle and even of attitudes and resulting actions within a circle of peers at the expense of the possible plurality of ways of life and the free exercise of the individual's personal power. Such standardization can be reached, for example, by minimizing the display of economic and social differences within the group of relevant decision makers and their joint demeanor towards and versus outsiders. It is about an inside equality and an outwards exclusivity. Such homogenization requires tremendous cultural costs. Ideologizing the equality of actors who in fact constitute a rather heterogeneous group of unequals necessitates a demonstrative dissociation of those equals from all others. Of great relevance for the cohesion of such a group is therefore the establishment or intensification of a socio-political dividing line based on, for example, lifestyle and cultural practices and the creation of an ideology of social and political superiority claimed from it. All this does not require the establishment of legal boundaries along status differences, but can certainly be facilitated and legitimized by such legal categories. Another expression of this mixture of elements of equality and inequality is manifested in the middling discourse, which of course is not based on arithmetical equality, but rather on geometric equality. And that means that the proportional participation, for example, in the collective good, depending on each actor's value and reputation in the community. And so the metrios discourse condemns pleonaxia, so wanting too much, demands moderation within the group and outlines an ideal of oinomia. In short, it is an admonition of agatoi to their peers not to exploit social inferiors beyond measure and to limit conflict within their own group. It is about being a member of a circle of equals who are equally good among themselves, to not forego their collective social primacy in the community by socially distancing practices. Against this backdrop, the social space of diacritical feasts deserves attention. Characteristic of this type of feast is that its participants emphasize their cohesion as a group and their relative equality within their circle. To do so, they make use of an elaborate system of signs which is made possible by their material resources and is staged as an expression of a specific lifestyle. All this serves the purpose of creating social boundaries to keep membership of this group small and exclusive. And this abstract description, the discourses and practices of what we call the symposium are easily recognizable. And an important actual space of ethical homogenization were the buildings in which those diacritical feasts often took place. The banquet halls and sanctuaries, many of which have traditionally been characterized as temples. Among many examples, one could adduce the hearth houses of Dreros, the 7th century Naiskoi in the Sami Heraion, or the oikos of the Naxians on Delos. In the material culture of archaic Greece, an ethical homogenization which hints at cartelization is reflected, for example, in the countless manifestations of standardization and austerity, as can be observed in votive and funerary practice. This curbing of an individual's or a group's expression in material culture could go as far as in the polis of Crete from the late 7th to the 5th century. The many inscribed laws from the island clearly reflect social stratification and concerns with accumulation of property, but typical elite practices seem virtually invisible in the archaeological record. And behind this, it seems, were conscious decisions throughout the island, testimonies to an ethical homogenization, which was intended to level internal differences of the Eleuthoroi in order to strengthen their cohesion as a group versus all others, notably the large numbers of slaves living among them. In general, the laws of numerous Greek polis offer signs of such ethical homogenization and standardization of patterns of action, in short, of institutions, which should be seen in the context of cartel formations. First of all, those rules need to be mentioned which aim to curtail the personal power of functionaries, limiting their range of action, laws that at the same time attempted to further the principle of institutional power by creating a fabric of institutions, as well as the concepts of collegiality in terms of office. Now, all that meant that more men could act in roles of socio-political prominence than before. And those functionaries were given both a duty to act in certain defined cases and the right to have a monopoly on specific patterns of action. And it seems to me that offices were key institutions to cartel formation. Holding an office was just one of several possible roles of prominence for a political actor, but it was a stronger signal that a man was accepted within the group of the relevant decision makers than his mere material potency and his commitment to a specific resource-intensive lifestyle could show. And I'm almost at the end here. So many other laws equally aimed to foster ethical homogeneity among the political actors, laws that, for example, regulated the transfer of property and the use of natural resources, farmland, pastures, and water. They were intended to limit the bearers of great personal power in their potential trespassing on the weaker. And they were limited in their occupation and usufruct of polis land, their accumulation of assets by way of marriage and adoption, and their pushing others in long-term debt bondage. In short, these laws defined rules of the game within the group of relevant decision makers. Institutionalizing cooperation makes sense as a mechanism of cartel formation to secure the positions of power for a collective of relevant socio-political actors under controlled circumstances. Likewise, numerous testimonies of ostracism rituals, of flight and expulsion may be understood as mechanisms of ethical homogenization. We grab this, for example, in the inscribed banishment decree from 5th century Miletus. And here it becomes clear which measures this abstract entity of institutional power, the polis, took to effectively implement the persecution, such as bounties and, again, the obligation of the public officials to act. And alongside such testimonies of expulsion and exile, there are the numerous narratives of what we used to call colonial ventures led by prominent men who were marginalized in their homeland. For example, the elder Miltiades of Athens, whom according to Herodotus, the Dolonkians from Thrace asked for help. And to quote Herodotus at the end, Miltiades, who was impatient of the rule of Pisistratus and desired to be away from it. Thereupon Miltiades, son of Cypselus, that Miltiades, who had before won the 4-horse chariot race at Olympia, took with him all Athenians who desired to share his enterprise, and sailing with the Dolonkians gained possession of their country, and they who had brought him in made him their tyrannos. Stories like these reflect that Aristotle, with claims for leadership that were not satisfied in their own homeland, could well go the way of the adventurer, at the end of which might stand prominence and leadership in other communities. Apparently, there were viable exit strategies for those who did not find joy in institutionalized cooperation in consensus and cartelization, or who were excluded from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar, for this thought-provoking and wide-ranging essay on cartelization and the concept of kind of cartelization as an institutionalization of cooperation, inclusion, and exclusion, if I may summarize your paper correctly. So now the digital floor is open for discussion, and I would like panelists and attendees to raise their hands, their digital hands, for questions. I already see one, Hans van Vees.
Yeah,
you have.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you, Gunnar, for a spectacular paper. I agree with a great deal of it, and you put it better than I ever could. I wondered, I suppose, slightly what happens at the end of your story. So for the Archaic period, I guess you analyze the processes brilliantly. I suppose that in some parts of Greece, something happens to break up the cartel or to extend the cartel. Or I realize you've concentrated on the Archaic period, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about the sequel.
Yes, indeed. I focused on the Archaic period, but I believe one of the benefits of the model is that it just describes, less concrete cartel formations than rather a mode of action, a pattern of action. And I believe you could describe just as well Athenian citizenship or Spartan citizenship by using this model of cartelization. So you have a club, of course, now wider club of citizens, but who are very much emphasizing their own togetherness and equality vis-a-vis outsiders. And yes, so I believe, I mean, it's of utter importance to emphasize that what I described with cartel formations does certainly not only is certainly not limited to a small number of basileis within a community, but it can also be used to describe the building of the Roman nobilitas. For example, this is a much better example than archaic Greece, actually, or it can be used for for classical Athens or Spartan citizenship, I believe.
Yeah. If I may follow up just briefly, so that I take your point. I just wonder then whether there's anything in the cartelization model that would help us understand what kind of cartel we are getting at any given point. So whether it's a tiny elite, as maybe in, I don't know, 7th century Corinth, or a broad citizen elite as in classical Athens. I mean, maybe we just need a different explanatory model to account for that, or does the cartelization model itself allow for an explanation of those differences?
Yeah, we should not start by looking at by looking for concrete cartel formations, but we should be looking at modes of action. So we should be looking for strategies of exclusion, for discourses of equality, for the kind of institutions that were thought to be able or viable mechanisms to secure privileges, for example. And then we should look at the group who profited from these regulations, from this framework of institutions, and thereby we can detect concrete cartel formations. So by limiting the Athenian citizenship, we come to a much larger group of cartel members. But we should not start from looking at concrete cartel formations, but rather look at, phenomena in material culture, for example, phenomena of standardization instead of great variability that we observe at other times in cemeteries and in dedicatory practices in sanctuaries and so on. So indeed, we have certain. I would like to provide a certain set of indicators, and then we can try to come up with concrete cartel formations if we like.
Thank you.
Before I give the digital floor to David Lewis, I would like to remind to the attendees that if they press the button called panelists, their participants at the bottom of their screen, then they can raise their digital hand and be able to pose a question to the speaker. So, David Lewis.
Thanks very much. Gunnar, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
So thanks very much. So if I understand you correctly, you're using Georg Simmel's theory of the cartel to understand how elites kind of stabilize and entrench their position through practices of uniformity and austerity. So for example, how the Spartans, by becoming homoioi and sharing a similar lifestyle, kind of lowered their participation costs in elite competition and thereby secured on a firmer footing their privileges. Is that right?
Perfect, yes. Yes.
So this seems to me a very fruitful kind of etic observer's theoretical framework for understanding ancient behaviors that we can see in the sources. My question is, how do you envisage this phenomenon from an emic or actor's perspective? So to just reference a paper of John's on democracy without theory, that was, I think, very successful way of looking at the emergence of Athenian democracy based on essentially the aggregation of many minor decisions that were historically contingent rather than a teleological explanation of democracy. So how do you envisage cartelization without theory? How did these actors end up producing these behaviors without the theoretical knowledge of Xydopoulos?
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, David.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I try to combine emic and etic approach by at the beginning I said I'm interested in model actors, and of course we cannot look at concrete individuals. How, you know, of course we have named individuals, but we cannot grasp them as individuals and look at their thoughts. Of course not. But we can look at the discourses that are produced, and they give us an impression of the scope of possibilities of action and the framework of what seemed possible and impossible and so on. So yeah, so I mean, this is why I started with these building blocks of game theory, and just very basic and down to earth building blocks of game theory, to say, well, you know, we have a number of individuals whose prominence within their community is very precarious, and they are looking for ways to stabilize their precarious prominence. So all the Homeric or yeah, probably most of all the Homeric basileis have is their personal power. They have to personally impress. But what we observe shortly afterwards in scenarios like in the earliest laws is that we have this this phenomenon of institutional power. So the major actors have come to terms somehow, and I believe among themselves in their own groups, not by pressure by downwards pressure also, pressure from the socially inferiors, but it was in their own interest, and this is how I take the on the ground view. So I'm trying to imagine the mindset of a model actor in the time by looking at what is being discursified in the sources we have, and I'm looking at the very basic interests of each individual's actor trying to be part of a group of major profiteers, but then to close this group fairly soon after himself, so that he will not have to share his own parts of the profit with too many other people. So this, I believe, is the emic view, or this lets me reconstruct the emic view.
Thanks very much. That makes a lot of sense. So it's really the aggregation of many small individual strategic behaviors.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Paschalis, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Edward Harris has raised his hand. I suppose he wouldn't.
Good. Gunnar, thank you very much for that paper, which I must say I'm very much in agreement with. And I just wanted to say that this is also very much in line with a recent paper, which I'm sure you know, by Douglas Cairns, looking at the concept of time in the Homeric epic. And the old view was, of course, that this kind of competition for time is a kind of zero-sum game. That was the phrase that people will often use. And you would do anything to kind of to increase your own time. You would do anything to kind of do in your rivals. In other words, your gain, their loss was your gain. Douglas Cairns, I think, in a very good analysis, has shown that time actually in the Homeric poems is really gained by showing adherence to these either group norms. Now they may be within the small group, as you were talking about, but also kind of within the larger group. Again, I think especially of the case of the debate between Diomedes and Agamemnon in Book 6 of the Iliad, where Diomedes goes way too far, and Nestor, in a very tactful way, more or less kind of says there are ways to kind of debate and there are ways not to debate. And the person who stirs up trouble within the group is one person who's going to be absolutely banished. So this is, I just was wondering, I think you probably know the article, but I think it's very much in line with this kind of reevaluation of the functioning of time in the Homeric epic.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Yes, I know the article and I like it very much. So the example you were talking about is very interesting because if I remember correctly, Nestor upbraids Diomedes while they're still in public.
Yes.
And then they go, they gather as a small group, and then Nestor it takes on Agamemnon and upbraids him as well, and he says, you know, your behavior is well, this is rather too simply said, is not in order. But this is a very good example for me that there is this circle of leaders that have their differences, but these differences should not be uttered out in the public. In the public, they should, I mean, the ideal is to display some kind of unity, and within their own circle, they can talk more openly. And the danger is that Diomedes is putting this to the people, his harsh criticism. And of course, I mean, we already spoke about the Thersites example. I mean, I believe that, I mean, I've always been wondering, you know, why is Odysseus saving Agamemnon the day? I mean, we all often emphasize that these guys were rivals, and so why does Odysseus, already having the scepter, does he not snatch the command from Agamemnon in this situation where Agamemnon is obviously at his weakest? But this, I would also say, is a very good example of cartel solidarity. Mm-hmm. So they have agreed on a certain leadership structure, and there is this criterion: Agamemnon has brought the most men. They have agreed on it, and if they change that, if they let explode the whole enterprise, this will have a catastrophes. Consequences. There will be this. I'm sorry, I'm running out of English words. But so maybe you already understood what I was hinting at. Sorry.
Xydopoulos would like to say a word, but first I will. I think Robin Osborne also raised his hand, so he has the floor.
Thanks very much. In some sense, I want to ask the same thing as Hans, but I'm going to ask it in a very characteristically blunt way. Right? So, faced with the question of historical change, am I right in understanding you to be telling us there is no historical change? All societies work in the same sort of way. We might as well, we all really ought to be social scientists, because there's no historical particularity. Any society you look at, you can find the same sorts of phenomenon taking place. So this is a sort of challenge. Is there any historical change in your world, or are there just particular mechanisms that you can find in any society? And lo and behold, we can find examples here and we can find examples elsewhere. But you know, this whole conference is barking up the wrong tree.
Well, when I'm looking at cartelization, I am looking at a category that is on the same level as competition and institutionalization. So it is a category. It's a sociological category. Unfortunately, there is no sociology of the cartel. It needs to be written still. But it is a neutral heuristic tool. It's nothing essentialistic. We can look at change by looking at, in what I said in answer to answer Hans's question, how do the groups that make use of cartel formation change, or how does historical change that manifests itself, is driven by actors and manifests itself by different configurations of actors having power at this time or that time, so the change from smaller elites to larger elites, I would say, in the context of classical Athens or classical Sparta. So we observe change, and we can choose as one of the tools to better grasp the groups of actors that facilitate this change by looking at various tools, but one tool might be the cartelization tool. So just because cartelization can be found, I would say, all over the place. It's not only in archaic Greece, but it's also in later periods of Greece. It's not only in Greek history, but Roman history. And it's actually, because it's a sociological category, it's everywhere in social history, and not only in history, in world history, and not only in history, of course. It is a rather neutral category. So just because we can use cartelization everywhere, it does not mean that there is, that because of this sameness of the heuristic tool, there is no change. No, change, we need change. Yeah. If that made sense.
Sorry?
If that made sense.
Kostas, we still have 4 minutes now, so I think it's time for our last questions. If I see no other question by any of our attendees. No, there seem to be no raised hands there. So Kostas, the last question.
I think I understood your argument a bit different than Robin did, though my question will be quite similar. I think I heard you as saying that basically what you described was the invention of a game in the archaic Greece, a particular kind of game. It doesn't exist in quite the same way in all societies, but a game played in certain ways. And that is some kind of change, because it didn't exist in 1000 BCE, and at some point it starts to take place under particular rules. The question then again becomes, do you see that game as changing in the course of Greek history? And I think so far we've heard 3 papers from people who are primarily archaic historians, and that tells us something quite significant about how stimulating it is to work on the archaic period, but we really need the contributions of people working in later periods, in particular the Hellenistic historians, to tease out the implications of change in the long term. And I want basically to ask if you think about the implications of 2 factors as factors of change. The one is ideology as a separate thing with its own kind of rules, in its own implications, its own history. I think I quite agree with John when he described Athenian democracy as emerging without theory, but once theory is created, it starts to have its own effect in the history of Athenian democracy. B, the wider world. What you describe is a game played within a particular community, but how do things change once you have external powers, Sparta and Athens, Macedonia and the Hellenistic kingdoms, Rome, that start to have a very significant impact on the game played within one particular community?
I believe the main difference, and you correctly highlighted that, Kostas, is that we need, or my model needs institutions. So in a time before there are institutions, and I'm using, as you can see from my handout, a rather soft definition for institutions by Berger and Luckmann. So I'm not looking at hard political institutions, but I'm looking at, I put it down here, institutionalization occurs whenever there is a reciprocal typification of habitualized actions by types of actors, as the definition is by Berger and Luckmann in the social construction of reality. So rather soft institutions rather than hard institutions, so to speak. So my model needs institutions as mechanisms safeguarding cooperation. So 1000 BC, less so, from 700 BC onwards or so on, more so, and then through the course of history. To be honest, I would have to think about the impact of outside powers. would not dare to come up with an impromptu answer now. I can only thank you now for the suggestion. I haven't quite understood what you meant by ideology, but I had a thought that I might formulate now. I think the main, or one of the benefits of this model is that, and
can I give you an example of what I have in mind?
Yes, please do.
The primaries of the American political parties. Now, the primaries work with an assumption. It's at the end, the party elites who will decide who is going to be their candidate. But once they introduced mass participation in the process, the ideology that basically it's the voters who will determine who is the candidate exists as well. And as we saw in the last round in 2016, there could be potential conflict between what the voters want and what the party conferences and their mechanisms will decide. So there is the institutional setting on the one hand, but there is also ideology on the other, and they might clash once ideologies exist separately. That's what I have in mind, for example.
You just made it more difficult to answer by contributing. Yeah, no, I don't. No, I can only thank you for the suggestion. I put it down. I would need to think about that. I cannot say anything hopefully smart about it at the moment. Just one thing I wanted to emphasize, because I had this thought when you formulated your question. I mean, the thing is that I've been primarily talking about the polis, but of course, cartelization is not it can be found not only in the context of the polis, but it can all be found in Thessaly as well. And you can describe various. You can transcend the Aristotelian categories, and you can describe different political systems that we are used to label in a very different way. You can label different kinds of monocracy and a tyranny and the reign of a genos or whatever. You can describe these very different things with a common heuristic tool, and I believe this is one of the main benefits. You can describe different centuries and different political systems with one heuristic tool that plays in the same league as competition or institutionalization. So, yeah.
I just got in here. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Seelentag, for this stimulating talk. And it's time to move on. I think Kostas is giving you quite a lot of homework to do, so you can continue afterwards. I will introduce the next speaker. Before I do that, can I ask the panelists, if you're not speaking or involved in conversation, please keep your microphones off, because every sound that you make, the camera focuses on you again. So if you can turn them off, and we'll be fine. So Professor Edward Harris from Durham, he is a well-known expert. Again, I don't think people need introduction here on law. He will be speaking about legal matters. Can I anticipate in his talk, if you look at your chat, there's also a handout?
Yes, there is a handout. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay.
There you go. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, χαιρετισμούς από την Αθήνα. Είναι μεγάλη τιμή να κάνω αυτή την παρουσίαση στο συνέδριο που έχουν οργανώσει η Καταρίνα και ο Κώστας για τον John Davies. Αλλά λόγω της πολύ δύσκολης κατάστασης, μου λείπει πολύ η φιλοξενία των συνάδελφων μας στο Rethymno και η κριτική κουζίνα και το doppio raki. Scary stuff. I think it's wonderful to be able to give this talk for John Davies. Katerina did an excellent job in talking about his many contributions to the field, his teaching, his service, again, in many ways. But I wanted to add just one small thing. I've always held John Davies up as an example of how to contribute and how to participate at conferences. John always listens to the entire paper. His comments are always perceptive. and they often start with the phrase, "if I may push you a little." And those of you who've participated in conferences with John know that he's very good at constantly kind of challenging us not only to draw out the implications, but especially to place what we're talking about in a larger context. And this is very much in that tradition, and I hope John will be happy with it. Okay. The new hyperbarchic law from Amphipolus in the très longue durée, changes in attitudes towards law and citizenship from the Archaic to the Hellenistic periods. There's a very long and self-indulgent handout. I would not suggest you looking at it, but it provides you with a lot of information which may be useful either in the discussion or afterwards. In 1984, an inscription of 139 lines, almost completely preserved, containing a law about the local eparch, dated to precisely 25 to 24 BCE, was discovered at the entrance to the gymnasium of Amphipolus. The text was published by Lazaridis with a contribution by Miltiades Xydopoulos in the Archaeology Ephemeris in 2015, and there have been important discussions, especially by Denis Rousset, with a response by Xydopoulos. Now, the provisions of the law go into much detail about the training of ephebes and the conduct of their instructors. The first clause requires those in the highest class to register for training. The second requires attendance every day and imposes penalties for non-attendance. The third clause concerns the selection of teachers, and the fourth subjects to be taught every day. The fifth clause sets a 2-year training period and a dress code. The sixth clause imposes strict rules about the conduct of ephebes outside and inside the gymnasium, followed by a seventh clause about attendance, and an eighth about their training. The ninth clause sets rules for a monthly contest. The 10th clause concerns the selection of contestants. The 11th clause orders the ephebarch to swear an oath about his duties and the award of prizes. The 12th clause gives rules about competitors and absences for illness or for funerals. And the 13th and 14th clauses impose fines on teachers and others who attempt to have improper relations with the ephebes, a topic which seems to be a constant problem even today. The 15th clause is my favorite. It regulates the conduct of ephebes at dramatic performances, forbidding them to applaud or jeer, and forbids them to any others to sit with them. The 16th clause provides rules about processions and what ephebes will wear. The 17th clause discusses exemptions from liturgies and legal actions and resembles the rules for the ephebeia at Athens in the 4th century BCE. The 18th and final clause briefly concerns maneuvers. Now, the law is remarkable for the level of detail about the conduct of instructors and the training and behavior of the young men. The rules attempt to ensure that the ephebes will always be under the supervision of public officials when they are not under the eyes of their parents. There are even rules about clothing and how to behave in the theater. There is also an attempt to strike a balance between incentives in the form of honors for good behavior and disincentives for officials, young men, and parents in the form of fines for noncompliance. The institution of the ephebeia was not unique to Amphipolus in this period, and in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BCE, as Nigel Kennel and Andrzej Czamkowski have recently shown, this training of the youth spread throughout the Greek world in the period after 300 BCE. Now, what I would like to do in this paper is to place this inscription in the development of this kind of training in the context of a larger set of developments in the Greek world from the classical period to the Hellenistic periods. So, Kostas, I will be talking about change. I am also going to look at 2 other developments which are often analyzed separately, but I hope to show also should be placed in the context of a shift in attitudes towards law and citizenship, the growth of the honorary habit in the award of crowns and statues, and the increase in the number of gymnasia controlled by the polis. At the end, if time permits, I will mention a 3rd development, the increase in the number of stone theaters and dramatic festivals in the period after 350 BCE. All these developments, I believe, are related, but to understand the connection between them, we need to start in the late Archaic period and the early Classical period, then study the intellectual developments of the late 5th century and the 4th century in Athens. Now, I start with Athens and 3 aspects of laws and decrees in the 5th century. First, Athenian democracy provided no public education in schools or training for the youth. In Thucydides' version of the funeral oration of Pericles, the leader boasts that unlike these Spartans, the Athenians are naturally brave and do not require training imposed by the laws. He is alluding to the fact the Athenians did not prescribe physical training. The old oligarch, in a work roughly dated the same period, also complains that the average Athenian had no training. And in the Memorabilia, Xenophon recounts that Pericles, the son of the politician, complained about the lack of training in contemporary Athens. In his Areopagiticus, Socrates claims that in the good old days, the youth were closely supervised, unlike the case in the present. Now, these good old days were, of course, a glorious past invented by Socrates to create an ancient precedent for his proposed innovation. But he is accurate about the lack of training in contemporary Athens. And even as late as the second half of 346, when Aeschines delivered his speech against Timarchus, the education of the youth was still in the hands of private teachers. According to his rival Demosthenes, these teachers included Aeschines' father. The traditional education by private teachers in this period included literature, music, and athletics. These subjects were taught in schools or in palaestras, but it appears that the state did not control the palaestras by placing them under the control of public officials. In the Hellenistic period, one of the most prominent offices in the city-state was the gymnasiarch. But in classical Athens, the official called the gymnasiarchos was only responsible for running games and played no role in supervising the gymnasia. For more advanced subjects, one could pay a fee and go to the sophists, such as Protagoras, and go and if you didn't want to pay a fee, of course, you could go to Socrates. What's interesting, however, is that this advanced instruction by the sophists aroused suspicions about their motives and the effect on their students. One recalls that among the charges against Socrates was the accusation that he corrupts the youth, and that when Aeschines mentions the trial, he assumes that this was the charge on which the judges convicted the philosopher. But if Socrates did not make the youth better, who did? When Socrates asked Meletus this question, his accuser has a ready answer: the laws. How do the laws make citizens better? According to the orators in court, the laws brought about moral improvement by exemplary punishment of wrongdoers, not by offering rewards for good conduct or by public training. In his speech against Timarchus, Aeschines warns the court, quote, "If Timarchus pays the penalty for his behavior, you will lay down the foundations for good behavior in the city." On the handout, I've given you several passages. This is, one finds these in many different orations, but I won't go through all of them. It's a topos. What is interesting to note is that the laws and decrees of the 5th century BCE and early 4th century BCE do not provide any positive incentives in the form of honors for good conduct by citizens, but only punishments for violating the law. I've collected the fines and procedures and decrees in IG1 cubed and found that 48 decrees contain fines and legal procedures out of 156 preserved. But one must bear in mind that many of these inscriptions are preserved only in fragments, and some with only a few letters, and that the actual percentage was probably much higher, perhaps half. And some of these are interstate agreements in which one would not expect to find penalties and legal procedures or decrees for proxenoi. One should also observe that the earlier penalties were generally much lower, but by the late 5th century, they become quite large, often with fines of 1,000 or 10,000 drachmas, and also atimia, the loss of rights. Now, this practice of threatening harsh penalties, but no positive incentives for good conduct, that is in the laws and the epigraphic record, can be found in the laws of other city-states in the late Archaic and Early Classical period. Any kind of reading through the decrees in Kerner, and you'll find, again, penalty after penalty after penalty, but no talk about rewards. Now, the most infamous proponent of punishment, of course, as a method of improving behavior is Cleon in the debate about Mytilene. As we all remember, the city had revolted in 428 and then surrendered in the following year. When the assembly voted out the city's fate, Cleon persuaded the Athenians to put all the Athenian adult males to death and sell the women and children into slavery. Several days later, the assembly started to have doubts, and there was another meeting. According to his Cleon, the Athenians should punish while their anger is still hot, and there's no excuse for the Mytileneans who are treated well. And their harsh punishment will teach other allies to remain loyal. And at the end, he urges his fellow citizens to make an example of them. Punish these men as they deserve and set a clear example, paradigma, for your other allies, that whoever rebels will be punished with death. If they understand this, you will spend less time fighting your allies and neglecting your enemies. And as we've seen in the passages above, Cleon is echoing the language of the courts. And we find again that he was characteristic for his prosecuting of enemies. Now, I'm not going to discuss the speech of Diodotus, which I've analyzed in detail elsewhere, but one statement is very interesting and has not drawn the attention of scholars. At one point, Diodotus says that in an earlier period, punishments were less severe, but as time went on, they grew more and more harsh and included the death penalty, yet men still broke the law. This is in sharp contrast to a statement of Lycurgus and others that punishments in the past were more harsh. Now, is Diodotus alluding to the fact that punishments in Athenian laws and decrees had recently become more harsh, yet were still not effective? Now, although what's interesting, however, is that unlike Cleon and other prosecutors, Diodotus begins to sow doubts about the effectiveness of punishment as a way of shaping behavior. Now, although punishments continue to be found in Athenian decrees and laws in the 4th century, there starts to be a gradual shift as we move from the late 5th century to the 350s. At Athens, most honors are for foreigners in the 5th century and early 4th century. As Philippe Gautier observed 35 years ago, the title Uergetes in this period is always given to non-Athenians and never to citizens. Now, Gautier and Bain believed that the only major honors were given post-mortem, such as the statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, with the exemption granted to their descendants. But this is not quite right. First, a passage from Andocides' speech to the council delivered between 410 and 404 mentions crowns for generals. And during the trial of the generals in 406, Euryptolemus mentions the possibility of crowns for generals. The honor of permanent right to dine in the Prytaneon was given to victors in the Panathenaic Games, but the first prominent Athenian politician to gain this, of course, was Cleon. The next person to gain this distinction, of course, major distinction, was Conon, who in 393 was given a statue in the Agora, an exemption from taxes and liturgies. And either in 389, according to Gautier, or 371, according to Dionysius, Iphicrates was awarded a statue with proedria and dining rights in the Prytaneon. Cabrius and Timotheus received similar honors about 375. Now, we should also recall that there was competition among the Prytanes of the council for the prize of best service in the late 5th century. The earliest evidence for this honor comes from about 4087. We should also recall that the Athenians honored the best politician by electing him to give the funeral oration, which took place every year and dated back, well, to at least the 460s, possibly earlier. Finally, as Mirko Canavaro points out in his commentary on Against Leptines, after the capture of Aegean in 475, there was a herm erected to the victorious generals for their uergesia. And shortly after the Persian Wars, the Athenians erected a monument at Delphi to celebrate their victories, which included a statue of Miltiades. Years later, the generals Miltiades and Callimachus were depicted in the portrayal of the Battle of Marathon in the Stoa Poikile, something Yet, there were fewer awards for citizens in the 5th century. This is a fairly exhaustive list. But the practice of honoring prominent citizens was clearly already in existence in the 5th century. Philotomia and euergesia were therefore not new phenomena in the 4th century, and they are one that certainly did not originate in the demes. Now, but the honors for Athenians, they increased markedly in the 4th century. The first inscription honoring members of the council is dated to 343-2, but the practice appears to have begun earlier. In 355, Androtion proposed honors for the council in the previous year, and there may be another decree for Athenian officials around this time. And there is evidence for council receiving a crown in 357-6, which shows that the practice was well established by then. We also know from the accounts of Aeschines and Demosthenes about the negotiations surrounding the peace of Philocrates, and that the council and the assembly might award crowns to ambassadors at this time. There are other examples in the epigraphic record. As you can see from the handout, when you get a chance to look at it, the pattern is very clear. There are no honors for Athenian officials in the epigraphic record before about 350. aside from the victorious prytany of the council and in the literary record for famous generals, and then for the council around 360. The practice of granting honors to foreigners continues, there are about 60 of them, as do proximity decrees, there are about 31, and awards of citizenship, there are about 6 in this period. But the pattern of more honors for citizens as opposed to foreigners continues in the period from 300 and 299 down to 230, 29, a period that is over twice as long. During this period, I count 8 proximity decrees, 29 honors for foreigners, but 72 honorary decrees for Athenians. To these must be added a new category, honorary decrees for prytanes and lists of prytanes, which reach 47. I've not included the years 322 to 309 because during these years Athens is not a democracy, and we're still, of course, waiting for the volume from of the decrees of that period. Now, there's clearly a shift in the epigraphic record. In the epigraphic record, the shift has gone from punishments in the 5th century to incentives and honors in the late 4th century and in the 3rd century. 2 points about this shift. One should not conclude that the Athenians were introducing the use of honors for citizens in the 4th century. As we saw, also, the Athenians considered political office an honor, time, and a reward for virtue, arete, as Pericles states in his funeral oration. Nor should we follow Lambert, who claims that the Athenians democratized honor in the late 4th century. The Athenians had already democratized honor in the 5th century by giving access to the honor of public office to average citizens through the use of the lot. And I'm not sure we should follow Lambert and Little, who also believe that the increase in honorary decrees to stimulate public service was a reaction to the threat of Macedonian expansion. The use of honors to encourage the council to build triremes dates from the early 350s, long before the Athenians considered the growing power of Philip a danger. And the award to the prytanes for best service in the council goes back to the late 5th century. And let's face it, it's hard to see how honors for someone who supervised public fountains could have helped stop Macedonian army. All the Athenians did was to use the rewards that were formerly given as incentives, primarily to foreigners, as a way of encouraging citizens to serve the community. The progression was de haut en bas. First for successful generals, then for the council, and then for other offices. It did not suddenly take off after the fall of Olynthus. Now, the increase in honors provoked a sharp reaction from some politicians. At the end of the speech against Aristocrates, Euthycles contrasts the past with the present. In an earlier period, the Athenians honored men like Miltiades and Themistocles by choosing them as their leaders. Recently, however, the Athenians have granted Timotheus, Iphicrates, and Chabrias excessive honors. He claims that the inflation of honors has been accompanied by a reluctance to punish the guilty. In the old days, public buildings were impressive, but now they are cast in the shadow by private houses. In the past, the people were masters of politicians, but now they are their servants. And we find similar criticisms by Aeschines in his speech against Ctesiphon. Now, the most eloquent defender of honors for public service is Demosthenes in his speech against Leptines. Leptines had passed a law abolishing exemptions granted to foreigners and citizens for public service, mainly as a money-saving device during the social war, when public funds were at a low ebb. Despite the fact that some are raised above others, Demosthenes insists that this practice is completely democratic and that to remove the people's right to reward benefactors would limit the powers of the democracy. To justify the practice, he recalls that the benefits received from generals like Conon and Chabrias and foreigners like King Leucon. He also predicts that abolishing the rewards will damage the reputation of the Athenians in the future and reduce the number of benefactors also. Demosthenes draws an interesting contrast here between Athens and Sparta, which may help to explain the difference in the epigraphic habits between the two cities. He says that the Spartans do not deny honors to outstanding citizens, but give different honors, which are in keeping with their different constitution. Quote, when someone conducts himself in the correct manner and is selected for what they call the gerousia, he becomes the absolute master over the masses. There, the prize for excellence is to win control over the state along with one's equals. In our city, by contrast, the people have control, and there are curses, laws, and safeguards to prevent anyone from seizing power. There are also crowns, exemptions, dining rights, and similar honors that any good man might win. These practices are correct, both theirs and ours. Why? Because in an oligarchy, the fact that all the leaders of the community have an equal share creates unanimity among them, which reminds us of the previous paper. And for democracies, the competition among good men to win prizes awarded by the people protects liberty. So we get a very interesting contrast between honors in Sparta and or an oligarchy and also Athens. The contrast is illuminating because election to oligarchic office, unaccountable to the people, is an honor, and honors that provide recognition do not grant additional power. When an Athenian got an honorary degree, and I think it was, one of the reasons I'm giving this paper is because John will also be getting an honorary degree. So I thought the topic actually would be topical for the conference. The main thing is, though, is that the Athenians did not place people they honored above the law and democratic accountability. What is interesting is that this analysis provides a good explanation for the absence of honorary decrees in Sparta. Also interesting is how Demosthenes uses the language of honorary decrees to support his arguments. There's no reason to see Demosthenes' arguments as elitist and offensive to democratic sensibilities. Demosthenes shows how honorary decrees reward benefactors and encourage public service without creating a class of oligarchs who can control the state. Now, the court obviously agreed with Demosthenes, Absiphion, and Phormio because they voted to overturn Leptines' law. But we should also note that most Greek polis in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE tended to follow the Athenian practice of awarding honors without granting additional political power while rewarding benefactors, and not the Spartan practice rewarding benefactors by granting them permanent positions of power in government. The concern that the practice of granting honors will undermine democracy and the rule of law is also seen in Aeschines' case against Ctesiphon. Aeschines expresses concerns about the assembly voting honors for officials before they underwent an examination of their conduct after their term of office. If the court found the official guilty of a crime, the judges would find themselves in the awkward position of contradicting the decision of the assembly and be reluctant to convict those who were obviously guilty. He notes that proposers, therefore, add the clause that honors are to be awarded only after the official passed his euthunai. That is clear, but is clearly not in favor of the practice. His statement about this kind of clause is confirmed by the evidence of honorary decrees, as I showed in an article published in 2017. There are many, many examples of this. Aeschines was clearly worried that the practice of granting awards to benefactors would disrupt the delicate constitutional balance between the assembly and the courts. The assembly had the power to elevate certain citizens by giving them crowns, the announcement of crowns at the Dionysia and proedria at festivals, and exemption from taxes. On the other hand, the courts followed the rule of equality before the law, which entailed that all officials are accountable. Excessive honors for some individuals in the assembly might undermine the principle of equality before the law in the courts. Even though the Athenian court voted against Aeschines at the trial by a wide margin, the Athenians appear to have taken seriously his criticism of this practice of voting for honors before the official finished his term of office, and adding this special clause that the honors would be awarded after the official passed the examination before the legistai and the euthunai. After the restoration of the democracy in 307 BCE, this kind of clause disappears from honorary decrees and is replaced by the statement that the official was voted honors after the successful completion of his euthunai. In other words, the assembly no longer tried to anticipate the decision of the courts, but acknowledged their priority in this matter. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that awarding honors concern just the relationship between the assembly and the honorand. There are four parties involved in an honorary decree. First, the people of Athens acting as a collective body in the assembly and showing that it has the power to reward as well as the right ethical character by showing gratitude and also by paying respect to moral excellence. The people do not only express gratitude, they are also good judges of moral character. This is a point, I think, which is kind of omitted in the recent book of Domingo Gigax, who stresses too much, I think, this idea of reciprocity between elite and mass. There's more to it than that. They're praised not just for what they've done, but also for their moral character, for their arete and their dikaiosune. And it's interesting that these two words, dikaiosune and aratai, begin to be more and more important actually in 4th century decrees and also in 3rd century decrees. They're very rare in the 5th century in inscriptions. Third, there's the honorand who receives recognition for his virtue and benefactions. Third, there are the other individuals in the community who see that the community rewards public service and are encouraged to emulate the honorand. This is not just implicit, but explicitly expressed in several honorary decrees in the late 4th century and the 3rd century. This theme develops in Athens, but is picked up by other city-states. Fourth, there are other communities in Greece who see that the Athenians are honest and just and respect the good Greek virtues of arete, dikaiosune, and eusebeia. These are Panhellenic values, not just democratic values. This is a point I think James Sickinger has very well made in a recent paper. Honorary decrees are not just an award to an individual by the community. They're also a way to shape the behavior of citizens and to create an image of the community abroad, an important theme in the Against Leptines. As Lycurgus and Demosthenes state, honors and punishments are the way to make Athens great again, if I may invent a phrase. The Athenians were very clearly thinking very hard in the 4th century about the ways of motivating citizens and encouraging public service. At the same time as this debate about honors, there was another important debate going on about the training of the youth. As we saw in the speech of Diodotus, they were starting to have doubts about the effectiveness of punishment in shaping conduct. In the Economicus, Xenophon implicitly criticizes the laws of Solon and Draco because they threaten punishments, but they don't offer rewards. We find similar doubts expressed by Glaucon and Adeimantus in the 2nd book of Plato's Republic. Both men argue that men choose to be just not because of the intrinsic merits of justice, but because of the benefits associated with refraining from injustice. Remove the threat of punishment, and the average person will commit injustice. We find similar arguments by Callicles in the Gorgias. Plato's solution in the Republic, of course, was revolutionary. He proposes the creation of a class of guardians who will receive special training. This will make them just and make them happy by creating just souls. Now, in the Plato extends this system of training to the entire citizen body, another radical innovation. In Athens, as we observed, the education of the youth was in the hands of private tutors, and more advanced subjects were taught by the sophists. Plato advocates the creation of a minister of education who sets the curriculum in gymnastics, dance, music, and literature. He also creates a supervisor of children, Laws 813. This is not the place to discuss the influences on Plato's legislation, but one should not exaggerate the influence of Spartan training of the youth on this work. In fact, Plato several times insists that Spartan training was flawed because it concentrated on one virtue, the military, and neglected other virtues. This emphasis on training the youth also appears in Book 7 of the Politics, where Aristotle argues that one cannot make citizens happy without making them virtuous. And the way to make them virtuous is not only to offer positive incentives for good conduct and punishment for bad, but also strict education from an early age. Unlike Plato, however, Aristotle is less radical, and note that several cities already had officials called paidonomoi. At Athens, this concern with shaping the character of citizens by training culminated in the reform of the ephebeia in the 330s on the direction of Lycurgus. And his speech against Leocrides, delivered in 331 BC, shortly after the reform, celebrates its role in promoting patriotism and virtue. Now, it is certainly not without significance that Lycurgus was said to be a student of Plato. This is a large topic, but I would like to make a few points before moving on to the points of continuity from classical to Hellenistic. First, the growth of honors during the 4th century and the new interest in the training of citizens were not unrelated, but clearly two aspects of an increasing concern for improving the character of citizens and encouraging patriotism in public service. In fact, some of the most numerous honorary decrees from the Hellenistic period are for ephebes and their trainers. Second, these two practices spread throughout the Greek world in tandem, in the same way as they developed in Athens. Honors for foreigners, such as those proxenoi, also occur in other cities, but honors for citizens are an innovation of the Hellenistic period, as shown in a very valuable recent study by Florian Forster. At the same time, one witnesses the spread of the ephebeia throughout the Greek world, and with this development, the increase in the numbers of gymnasia also, and its control by the community through the office of the gymnasiarch, as is shown in the valuable study of Crete. On the handout, again, this is to encourage you to see the handout, I have listed the cities in which gymnasiarchs are attested. The number comes close to 300. Several decrees explicitly mention the role of gymnasiarch in education, including the one from Eretria about hiring a philologist. One should also note that the increase in the number of officials called paidonomoi. They appear to have existed in several cities when Aristotle wrote the Politics, but they increased during the 3rd centuries and the 2nd centuries BCE. This is also on the handout. All three phenomena are linked. The training of the youth often occurs in the gymnasium, as we see from the ephibarchic law of Amphipolis, and honorary decrees and statues are also erected now in the gymnasium, as opposed to, say, in the Agora or in the Acropolis, as in Athens. And the gymnasium now achieves a prominence unknown in the classical period. All these practices reflect an increased attempt to encourage patriotism and to shape the lives of citizens. As we've seen, this movement starts in earnest in the 4th century and takes off in the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BCE. It's interesting for the question of periodization, because this is something which kind of leaps over, more or less, the campaigns of Alexander. In this respect, his conquests don't bring about a fundamental change. They only expand the geographical space in which these developments continue to advance. Now, I end with two thoughts. First, I wonder if the development of dramatic and musical festivals also needs to be placed in this context. Plato certainly believed that such festivals played a central role in shaping the character of citizens. And in the speech against Leocrides, the politician Lycurgus observes that while the laws indicate what should be done and what should not be done, tragic poets provide clear examples of good conduct. Here's another area where the polis paid increasing attention to influencing the behavior of citizens. And you can see from the list, which again is on the handout, that there are very few stone theaters in the 5th century. The number starts to grow in the early 4th century, but really takes off after 350 BCE. The increase continues through the Hellenistic period down to the Roman conquest. This led to an increased demand for actors, which led to the creation of the Dionysiac artists. Again, another change. Now, as one can read also in numerous decrees about the artists, their tasks were not just entertainment, but also religious, promoting piety and good relations with the gods. But the development of these dramatic festivals was also closely connected with the growth of the honorary habit. In a very valuable study, Paolo Ceccarelli, whom I hope is listening now, has collected the honorary decrees which the assembly orders to be read out before dramatic performances. This is something that started happening in Athens, but obviously spread throughout the Greek world. The publicity created by these announcements provided yet another venue for inspiring citizens to perform their civic duties and for encouraging foreigners to support the community. This practice of announcing crowns in the theater started in Athens and then spreads. Now, this talk is concentrated on aspects of change from the classical to the Hellenistic period in laws and attitudes towards citizenship. I'm coming to the end. I would not call them revolutions in the Bolshevik sense. I don't think we need that sort of revolution. But these gradual changes should not blind us to the continuity also in other respects. First, there's no shift in laws grounded in religious rituals to a more secular approach to law. This is a view that goes back to Court Latta. Some scholars have claimed that the use of curses attached to laws as punishment started to die out during the 4th century, but as Lena Rubinstein showed in 2008, these curses retained their potency all the way down to the Roman conquest. Robert Parker, following Douglas McDowell, claimed that views about pollution resulting from homicide were dying out in the late 5th century, but as shown in 2 essays, Parker's view is unfortunately undermined by much evidence, and strongest actually being the new law from Theatera dated 2nd century BCE, containing 2 clauses about pollution for homicide. Second, in one of the earliest features of the rule of law in the Greek polis, dating back to the Archaic period, is the accountability of officials. This was a prominent feature of Athenian democracy in the classical period, and as Pierre Feuillich has shown in his excellent book, Le Contrôle des Magistrats, the practice of holding officials accountable and requiring to submit accounts continues right down to Actium. Third, one of the ways the Greek city-state attempted to prevent tyranny was to grant power not to a single official, but to a set of assistants, but to a board of magistrates. I collected these for the Archaic and Early Classical period, but this is a practice that continues on down. through the Hellenistic period. Fourth, Greek city-states exhibited a strong desire to keep their laws fixed and stable, as we've seen an entrenchment clause to prevent politicians from altering their provisions. They start in the late Archaic period, they go down through the Classical period, and they also continue on, as Rhodes and Lewis have shown in Decrees of the Greek State, all the way down to the Roman Empire. Fifth, the practice of probulisis, studied by Andrews and then examined by Rhodes, also continues throughout the Hellenistic period and is also studied by Rhodes and Lewis. Sixth, in the Classical period, there was a tendency to appoint officials for only 1 year at a time. This continues. Seventh, the concern with procedural fairness. That is an attempt to have a trial before impartial judges. This leads to a new development, however, which is the new use of foreign judges. That's an innovation, actually, of the Hellenistic period, even though it's within the rule of law kind of ideology that comes from earlier. Now, to sum up, Louis Robert, followed by his great pupil, Philippe Gautier, was quite right. The polis did not die after the Battle of Chaeronea. The evidence of the laws and decrees from Hellenistic states provide ample confirmation for this key insight. But Robert could have gone a little further. Not only did the institutions of the city-state continue to thrive, but they also kept on developing in new ways. A woman who lived in a Greek polis around 500 BCE, but then came back to life in 200 BCE, or even 150 BCE, let's call her Ripetta Van Winkle, would have found much about her community that seemed familiar, but she would also have found much that was new and strange. Many more stone theaters, public gymnasia run by gymnasiarchs and filled with ephebes, agoras filled with honorary decrees, and statues and surrounded by massive stoas. Whether Ripetta would have found life better for other women like herself must be the subject of another talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this very enlightening talk on the culture of honor and reward in the longue durée of the Greek city. Thanks to a typing error in the program, we have additional time for discussion. So we are well within schedule, and I invite everyone to raise their digital hands again. And let me remind once again to the attendees, to those who are not panelists, that if they click on the button participants, then they will see at the bottom right of their screen a way to raise their hand, and I will see it and give them the floor. So, questions. We already have one hand. Andrzej Sankowski, yes, please.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this very stimulating paper. There's just one minor point. Maybe I have not understood correctly what you said, but I think Gautier doesn't say that there was no that no citizen Athenian had been recognized as Euergetes. What he says is that the title of Euergetes, the official title, had never been given to a single Athenian citizen. And this title, as a technical term, was reserved to the foreigners. And as far as this very stimulating comparison is concerned between the values which are taught in the gymnasium and the values which are required in the public life, there's a very interesting passage of the famous inscription in honor of Menas from Sestos, in which this is said explicitly by the author of these decrees. It says that the emulation of the competition between the ephebes and neo in the gymnasium is preparing them for the competition which the citizens will run for the honors of the adult community. So it's this idea has been already formulated by the author of these decrees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It just shows that perhaps, why did I say partly tongue-in-cheek, some inscriptions are very philosophical. In that sense, it's not an absolute gap between the thoughts of the philosophers, but I think we also find this debate which is going on in the 4th century, and also these ideas. So thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'll have to take a look at that inscription again. Thank you very much, and I also thank you for your work on the ephebes. As you can see, was a great help actually for this talk.
Other questions or remarks? Yes, Manuela.
Hi, Edward. Thank you very much for this very rich and stimulating discussion of a number of important sources. I have just a suggestion or a short remark that I think goes in the same direction of your general reconstruction of the evolution of this culture of reward in classical Athens. I think that a very interesting way of checking this general evolution is the particular evolution of the noun philotimia and the lexical family of philotimia, philotimos, etc. That is, of course, we have a number of an increasing number of attestations in honorary decrees in the 4th century and in the Hellenistic period. But I think it is significant that this term and the related terms are used in a very ambivalent ways in 5th century authors, like Thucydides, for example, comes to my mind that philotimia is not always used as a positive concept by Thucydides and by other authors, while progressively it becomes, so to say, the main civic virtue. And I think the passage you quoted from Demosthenes, I think from the Against Leptines, explains very well this trend. I mean, the fact that competition or ambition to prevail over other citizens more and more was seen as a positive fact, and something that is strictly linked to democracy and its values.
Yes, no, that's very, thank you very much for that. Thucydides is a little careful, because I think in that one passage, I believe it's book 265, when he's talking about what happens after the death of Pericles, he doesn't just say philotomias, he says, I think it's dia idias philotomias. In other words, it's not the general philotomia, it's philotomia which is going to advance the individual's interest, but not the interest of the community. But I take your point. And again, I am very much following, of course, in the footsteps of Philippe Gautier, who also says this. And he's also kind of discussed, it's clear that even though this was taking place, there was a great deal of anxiety that this kind of generated. And we can see this in this debate, especially, and it seems to kind of crystallize around the period from about 360 to about 340. And there's obviously a great deal of debate, which then seems to be kind of settled. And there is this question about what is the relationship with democracy and its honors. And there is this anxiety that will create a kind of a separate class. But I think that's why I must say, I translated the Against Leptines about 12 years ago. And I didn't realize, it's been only in the last 2 or 3 years that I really realized how important a speech this is. And the one key passage, this key passage between honors in an oligarchy or aristocracy and honors in a democracy is really key. And what's interesting is it does seem to be the attitude towards honors, which is then picked up in the rest of many of the other kind of Greek polis. So thank you very much, Manuela.
Other questions? I still don't see questions from the attendees. Hans van Wees, yes.
Thank you very much, Edward. Yes, but just picking up on this question of the relation between democracy on the one hand, oligarchy on the other, and honors. Listening to some of the developments that you describe, I was put in mind of the previous paper where Gunnar seemed to be describing in, according to his own model, or similar kind of developments of institutionalization, trying to recall this, ethical homogenization, I think is the term you used, the gymnasium education, the theater experience comes to mind. And so, and specifically also the emphasis on competition, i.e. not just punishment if you don't do what you're supposed to do, but reward if you do better than others. Arguably that could equally, or perhaps better even, reflect maybe the kind of cartel-like institutions that Gunnar was describing, where you have both, a sort of a careful balance between competition within limits within the cartel, that the wider community as the third party that has to kind of approve or validate the the elite standing of the cartel, and then the kind of institutionalization that puts limits to competition that might threaten the position of the cartel. So I wonder if these developments you're describing, 4th century, 3rd century onwards, are a new form of cartelization, or indeed a reflection of democracy flourishing everywhere.
That's good. It's very good, and I think my paper does, to a certain extent, join up with Gunnar's paper, and in terms of that. But what's also interesting about this is that when Gunnar was talking about, in the Archaic period, those honors are really confined to the this cartel. The one thing is that Athens does is that it does democratize honors, but in the sense of giving honors to individuals in the 5th century. And that's considered a time. I mean, an office is a time. It's not just an arche. So in that sense, there is a significant, really serious change. But then the other thing is also is that then it's the leading people who get the great things like the statues and, to a certain extent, the honorary decrees and the other things. But what is interesting then is in the 4th century, the epigraphic habit spreads these epigraphic honors very, very wide, and also democratic in the sense that now obviously the ephebes, it's a large part of the population, but it's not the entire, it's not absolutely everyone. But again, it's spreading this out. So in a way, it's kind of, yes, it's against this cartelization, or if you want to call it, it's spreading cartel almost as widely for him as a citizen. But on the hand, foreigners have been played. Does that answer questions?
We're breaking up at the end, Edward.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hans is.
Now I think it's better. Okay. But
Okay,
I think
good.
you
Was
finished.
I frozen for a minute?
Yes, you were.
Yeah.
You're deep frozen now.
Okay, good.
I'm
defrozen? Sorry? Okay, good.
Before I abuse of my...
Did you hear me, Hans?
Yeah, yes, I think we got almost the full. Just at the end, a couple of sentences that were broken up a bit. But yeah, thank you. I think we got the point.
Yeah.
Before I abuse of my presidential rights and ask a comment, make a comment myself, I see we have a question from an attendee. Thomas Clements, if Kostas manages to activate him. You have to unmute yourself now. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
I'd like to ask a question about the.
Something's not.
Can I be heard?
Yes. Yes.
I'd like to ask.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. It's a fascinating, very wide-ranging paper. I'd like to ask quite a small question about the epigraphic basis of what is essentially an argument for quite long-term diachronic change. I'm thinking in particular of your quite brief comparison, referring to Demosthenes' comparison between how Athens and Sparta honor their citizens. It occurred to me that there are certain sanctuaries for which, on a purely epigraphic basis, that comparison sorry, can't possibly work, because we simply have so few Spartan inscriptions. So in plotting these sorts of patterns of diachronic change from inscriptions, for example, what are the dangers that we need to be aware of? Sorry, it's a very broad and rambling question, but
it's okay. I think he's frozen again. Is anybody else hearing him? Because I can't hear him. Maybe I want to go back to Paschalis. Paschalis, can you hear me? What? It says my network.
Paschalis, you need to unmute yourself.
Was I not clear?
Yes, yes, you were. Was your question finished?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Edward, would you like to comment on that, Edward?
Let's see if I can get closer to the thing. Can you hear me now, Paschalis?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you. You're a bit frozen, but we can hear you. Now you are dark, but we can still hear you.
That's okay. I'm just I'm just trying to move. I'm trying to move closer to the connection. Okay.
Okay. Now we can both see and hear.
On with Thomas? Yeah.
Thomas finished with his question, if I understand correctly. So if you care to comment on that.
In terms of that, I mean, one could say that this is a case of, is this the epigraphic habit? But that kind of assumes that the epigraphic habit operates independently of institutions. I would say that the epigraphic habit is to a certain extent driven by the institutions. And because the institutions are different, that creates a different kind of epigraphic habit. And again, I'm just quoting Demosthenes in that sense. Obviously, you're right, Sparta does have it. And it's not to say they don't have any other kinds of honors, but in terms of honors for citizens, this is this idea of the honorary decree, which is posted in prominent places, is very much an Athenian development and doesn't seem to be associated so much with oligarchic states. But Paschalis, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Or am I frozen again?
You're frozen, but we can hear you, so it's okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you very well, but you are occasionally frozen. It's no big deal. Don't worry about it.
It's okay.
So my question is the following. I quite agree with you that this evolution towards a new culture of honors was started in Athens, to put it very simply. But I wonder if the preponderance of the phenomenon throughout the Hellenistic world is not also related with the widening of the audience of these honorific decrees and this honorific language. With the increased mobility, with the interest of kings to attract talent to their courts, the very fact of someone receiving honors, even if it's receiving honors in his own city, can be significant for a political arena wider than the city itself.
Mm-hmm.
The example I usually like to adduce is a small honorific decree from the Macedonian polis of Gazaros at the time of Philip V, where at the end of the decree, we have the decision of the civic body, which is, in that order, first to relate the fact that Plistis was honored to the king, then to crown him, and then to set up a stele at the most prominent place, etc., which means that what mainly interested the honorant was that the fact that the king would know about it, would know what a good job he was doing. So this is a general phenomenon, I suppose, the fact that people were honored very often for things outside the narrow political arena of the city.
Yes, that obviously there's no question. But on the other hand, the honoring of foreigners goes back in Athens, of course, to the honoring to the role of proxenea and also honors for foreigners, which are very prominent in the 5th century. You're absolutely right, though, is that the rise of the Macedonian kingdoms after Alexander complicates this picture because we get, for instance, we get the philoi of the Macedonian kings. And there's several decrees, of course, in Athens in the 3rd century. You, of course, Paschalis, would know this much better than I, where people are honored, and they're honored because they're philoi of the Macedonian king, but at the same time, their ability, their status as philoi of the Macedonian king puts them in a position to provide benefits again for the city, which again complicates the picture. The one I was more interested in, though, and that to a certain extent, one might argue that's kind of continuity. I mean, that's just honoring foreigners, and we still have, for instance, Lucan being honored in the 4th century, and actually earlier. Here's a foreign king; he's providing benefits, and it's not just his kind of helpers. But no, you're absolutely right, and it gets actually more complicated. But this actually is getting back to Tom Clemence's question. What's interesting, and again, you would know this again better than I am. I'm not an expert in the Hellenistic period. Is that when the Hellenistic kings honor somebody, they honor someone with an office, and this is in the Macedonian cities, in the polis, you actually kind of find these kind of honorary decrees. But in terms of the court honors you by making you a member of the court, and not actually by making you a stele. But again, you're nodding. I'm not making. I'm not going too far wrong. Okay, good. And that actually, I think, would be the answer to Clement's question, which is a good question about this. Why do you have these kind of different habits? Again, the Macedonian kingdom is much more like what Demosthenes describes for the kind of the aristocrats. Is the aristocrats you get an honor is your position, whereas in Athens we don't want to create an aristocracy. We don't want to create a cartel, to use Gunnar's term. So we give you this decree, you're happy with that, but you remain a citizen like everybody else. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have another question from Andrei again, Tsankowski again, yes?
No, just a marginal point, but as far as this question we have been discussing is concerned, there's a very interesting parallel in the dossier of in order of Antiochus III from Theos, when he asked the citizens of Theos the citizenship is given to some philoi of the kings of the king in order to honor him. He cannot give the citizenship of some polis which are on his territory by himself. He has to ask to the polis to agree to it. So it's a little bit this problem we were discussed about.
Yeah. Good. I have nothing to add. Thank you very much for that, Andre.
There are no other questions. I think I can give the digital floor to Kostas, who has been waiting patiently to make his comment. Kostas Vlasopoulos, I mean.
Yeah, generally speaking, I find very convincing your whole argument about honor and reward. Two small comments. The first one, the Greeks are aware of this problem in the classical period. And in fact, you can find discussions where they comment that the Persian laws are better in this respect because the Persians make sure that the laws do not only punish people, but also reward good behavior. So here it's not just ethic, it's emic. There is an understanding that there is something missing. But my question is, did it make any difference?
You mean, were the city-states actually better managed? Were people more patriotic? I mean, this is, I have no idea. I would love to know if you have a firm idea about this. I don't know as one can kind of go and kind of take a temperature kind of the same way we do nowadays and checking whether people actually are infected or not. Unfortunately, I don't know how you can actually kind of measure this. I would generally, though, say that this, I think, is something for the Hellenistic historians to deal with. I'm really a specialist of the classical period. And this gets really into, it's a good question, though. It's Kostas, your questions are always great. This gets into this question of what are attitudes toward the polis? Is that what kind of continuity? That's why I brought up at the end, Kostas, certain elements of continuity, which are definitely still there. To what extent this actually has an effect on the behavior of the citizens? Well, I don't, the only thing is, I mean, we have the decrees. Are the decrees going to be evidence and of what people are actually doing? Or are they kind of presenting an image? I mean, that's the other thing is, to what extent is this a reflection of reality, or is this an extent of the city-states? And this gets back to your question of your ideology. Are they trying to project a certain kind of ideology and shows that it's still there, despite what may or may not be happening on the ground? But this gets into this the larger questions, which maybe other people were talking about in other papers, about, again, democracy in the Hellenistic period, and also, is there still democratic elements, or to what extent we're beginning to get, as Paul Vane argued and others have argued, especially when you get down to the 2nd century, are we getting to kind of have a set of nobles who are kind of really running the community? You have John Maw, for instance, in his recent book on statues, saying the statue bases show that no, even though there are a lot of individuals being honored, the statue bases really show by this quote syntax is that the polis is still in control. That's the message getting across. Other people, again, have approached this topic in different ways, and hopefully we're going to hear some other people who know much more about this topic than I do in the next few days.
I mean, just to emphasize that the traditional narrative about the Hellenistic period used to be social anomy.
Right.
And your argument is exactly in the opposite direction. And I think this needs to be stressed, how different is our perception of the Hellenistic period if we take your argument. Just that.
Well, I think that's for others to judge, and people who know more about the Hellenistic period than I do. Thank you very much, Kostas.
Πασχάλη, το μικρόφωνο, δεν ακούγεσαι.
I see we have one more question from an attendee, Natasha Terlexi. Kostas? You need, okay. Now we can hear you, I think.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Yes, many thanks for making it possible to attend this very interesting conference. Just a short question for Edward Harris. What do you see as a relationship between social inequality and this phenomenal tendency in increasing tendency towards awards? This change that you pointed out and quantified. Is it indirect? Is it an inverse relationship to the indirect relationship to the increase of inequality, or the other way around? This concern over democracy, does it reflect? Yeah, sorry.
Well, first of all, let's go back to the 4th century. First of all, these use of these honors creates, again, a great deal of anxiety in the democracy. And so there's a question about, is this going to really kind of create, I'd say, not so much a plutocratic class, but a kind of timocratic class. On the other hand, I think in most of the, and if you really want to look at a detailed study of this, it's Flavian Forster's excellent book. The question is who's also receiving this? Now, in Athens, again, it's not only the main officials are getting it, but again, the members of the boule, who represent a large portion of the Athenian population. And that's true, again, Manuela will tell us more about that, other people will know. But it's also in Flavian Forster's book, it's not just a narrow elite who is who's getting these honors, but it seems to be a kind of more widespread, and it's more accessible. In other words, it's not just kind of confined to use Gunnar's term, it's not confined to a small, it's not confined to a kind of small cartel. To what extent that plays in with a greater change in with a growing inequality in wealth in the cities, again, that's really a question of economic history, which I think is a separate question. It's a good question. It's an excellent one, but it's not one. And I'm not sure about the relationship between the two. I'm more interested in the question of kind of constitutions and also this epigraphic habit and this attitude kind of towards honors. So at any rate, it's kind of, I think I sound like a certain kind of politician who's trying to dodge your question. I'm not. I'm just saying it's a different kind of question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it. And okay, thanks, Natasha.
Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, haven't missed. Oh, Nikos Giannakopoulos.
Hello. Thank you very much, Edward. It was very fascinating. I just have one brief comment and a question. The way that Demosthenes views honors in 4th century democratic Athens is, at least in my view, quite different from the way that scholars studying late Hellenistic and imperial cities view honors. Okay, and this is very interesting, very, very, very interesting. But my question concerns the following fact: because we have studied the material, can you see a hierarchy of honors awarded to Athenian citizens in the 4th century BC? I mean, do the honors awarded to the members of the Boule, for example, are the same as the honors awarded to a distinguished diplomat or general?
Oh, there's definitely a hierarchy there. This gets into a debate. Philippe Gautier felt that there were these megistai timai, which were the really extraordinary ones. There were lifelong honors. He believed that there were basically rules instituted in about the middle of the 4th century, excuse me, this had to be regulated. In other words, these honors were so extraordinary that there had to be special procedures to kind of make sure that they didn't kind of get out of hand. Flavian Forster has challenged that idea of Gautier's. He doesn't think that there's any kind of regulation, but there definitely is, and that definitely. Alan Henry's book is very, very good in collecting the different types of honors, but there's no question about it, there is a hierarchy in Athens. And then also later on, I mean, the highest obviously are statues and proedrea. Graham Oliver has collected the evidence for statues and stressed, on the other hand, very good, short but very good article, stressing also that the thing that is also stressed in these awards of statues is the demos is always stressing that we are the ones who gave you this honor, and that doesn't change throughout the Hellenistic period. That continues on down. And the only one, I mean, if I want to throw another decree into the mix, it's that famous, Protogenes decree from it's Olbia. It's what is it, 2nd century BC, 2nd century BCE, isn't it? Yeah. And the one thing it's actually stressed in that, which Gautier is very, very good on, actually against Paul Vane. Paul Vane said, oh, they're creating a set of, he actually compares Protogenes, I think, to Lorenzo de Medici, and he said this is obviously kind of creating this aristocracy of notables. And Gautier is very good because by careful reading of the inscription, he shows that even though Protogenes has obviously got a lot of money, he's contributed a lot, he also stresses through that decree that he has always done everything according to the laws, and he has also actually undergone his euthunai at different times. So in that sense, there's a great deal of continuity between that decree and what's going on in Athens in the 4th century. Does that begin to answer? I mean, I just picked one example. I mean, we need to have, for instance, people who've been studying Iasos and other ones. And Flavian Forster is also very good he says that it's you have to look at every city differently. And also BR in his BR's excellent book on statues and the statue habit. It's different, actually. It seems to be much more abundant in Asia Minor. There seem to be kind of fewer as you move kind of to the west. So even though there are general tendencies, I don't want to diminish the fact that they're locally, it can play out in different ways. Does that answer your question? But I think this also this stress that even if you are getting honors, you are still actually you are still subject to the laws of the polis. And this phrase "katatus nomus," that you acted katatus nomus and you got your honors because you acted katatus nomus, that's fairly widespread. Somebody may want to contradict me, but that seems to be a general kind of tendency. And what this gets into this large question, which you probably know more about than I do, is there a shift in the power relationship in the Hellenistic cities? That's a separate topic.
Our timing is perfect because it is precisely 6:30. So if there are no other questions, I think it's time to have a short coffee break, if everyone agrees. And we reconvene at precisely 7 for the last talk of this session. Am I right?
Just to ask briefly, Katerina, to give us again the link to the Padlet in the chat, because as you will see when you go there, Edward's paper has already had impact. And if I know anything about the epigraphists present, I can guess what they will do once they go there. Enjoy your coffee.
See you in a while.
Shall we start for the last session? I think we should start.
Yep.
Thank you very much again, all, for joining us. So we'll have our last speaker for the evening, Ioannis Xydopoulos from the University of Thessaloniki. Again, no need for introductions, I think. And as far as I could see, there's no handout, so we should be handout free. I don't see, okay. So the podium is yours.
Thank you. I suppose that you have on your screens my PowerPoint presentation?
No, we don't.
No, you don't.
I think we're getting somewhere.
It's coming.
Got it now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So I would like also to thank the organizers for this invitation to honor John. And not to waste any more time, I will start my paper, which is on identities and change. And the case study that I will be talking for the next moments are the Macedonians. I feel somehow, let's say, bizarre, since everyone who has spoken today had abundant evidence on their case studies. Unfortunately, this is not the case with Macedonians. However, I will try to make things clear, and I'll try to persuade you that change also happened during the period of the Macedonian expansion, that is in the mid-7th and 6th century BC. First of all, I'd like to begin with some comments on identities and boundaries, which are closely connected during the early phase of the Macedonian expansion. This expansion began from their original nucleus around Mount Pangion towards Pieria and Votier, Almopia, Amphixitis, and Mygdonia. It's useful to make some preliminary comments focusing on the special difficulties arising from the specific topic. First of all, literary sources covering the period of expansion are absent. All the information we possess derives from later traditions and therefore is subject to critique. Second, the use of archaeological evidence is not considered a reliable basis for drawing concrete conclusions regarding identities and ethnicity. And third, the very character of the Macedonian kingdom after its first period of expansion, that is, its multi-ethnic form, is itself a problem. However, as I said, an effort will be made to enlighten this obscure but not completely dark period. The history of the Macedonian kingdom up to the end of the classical period is a history of conquests. In one of his most renowned passages on Macedonian history, in his second book, paragraph 99, Thucydides provides a short but concrete narrative regarding the Macedonian expansion from the slopes of Mount Vermion in Emathia to the north and northeast of that region. According to his description, it was the Macedonia of today, that is the Macedonia by the sea, which had been acquired first by Alexander, the father of Perdiccas, and by his ancestors, being Temenidae coming from Argos in early times. And they reigned, expelling by force of arms the Pieres from Pieria, who later settled Phagres and other small places beyond the Strymon under Mount Pangaeum. Indeed, the land between Pangaeum and the sea is still called today the Pieric Gulf, and the so-called Botiae from Botiaea, who now live as neighbors of the Chalcidians. And they, the Macedonians, acquired a narrow strip of Paeonia alongside the river Axius, running down from inland to Pella and the sea. Beyond the Axius, they cultivate the land called Mygdonia as far as the Strymon, having driven the Idones out. And they expelled also the Eordi from what is now called Eordia. The majority of them perished, and a small part of them have settled by Fisca, and the Almopes from Almopia. And these Macedonians acquired both from the other tribes the places which they still hold today, namely Anthemus and Christonia and Bisaltia, and from actual Macedonian tribes a large amount of land. The totality is called Macedonia, and Perdiccas was king of them when Sitalkis was invading. Thucydides confirms that Almopia was one of the first areas subjugated by the Temenid Macedonians, following the fate of Pieria, Botiaea, and a part of Paeonia. The Macedonians encountered mainly pre-Greek populations in these regions of Lower Macedonia or Macedonia by the sea, namely the Pierians, the Botiaeans, the Idonians, and the Almopians, who were, according to Thucydides, either killed or expelled. Based on the same passage, the late Nicholas Hammond stressed out that the Macedonians had to fight in order to oust the Pieres from Pieria and the Botiae from Botiaea. And as for the date of this expansion, Hammond continued by saying that, I quote, "The greatest military feats were in the first stage of the conquest, that is, against the Pieres and the Botiae, and that the policy of destruction and deportation was practiced in the first and second stages." He dates these two stages in the period 650-550 BC. The first question that comes to mind is to what extent can the literary sources define or even guide our handling of the archaeological data? This seems to have been the problem in many cases. Thucydides was clear enough, but archaeology seems to provide strong evidence for the progress of acculturation between the various peoples on the shores and in the hinterland of northern Aegean, thus supporting the idea that Macedonia, in its political sense, that is as a kingdom, was a multi-ethnic entity. Until fairly recently, the archaeological exploration regarding the early stages of the Macedonian expansion had quite satisfactory results. The situation, however, changed radically after the excavations conducted in the last 2 decades. Our data for the case study presented here is confined mainly to the mortuary rituals, as these were conducted in the cemeteries of the period under examination in Macedonia, something that brings us immediately before the problem of the so-called warrior graves. It has become evident from the archaeological finds that burial with weapons was a common feature of aristocratic burials in general and royal tombs in particular. As far as Macedonia is concerned, the Tumuli cemetery at Vergina, Aegean, on your map. In one case of tombs with weapons are actually the ones which are very interesting. And they are interesting because weapons are not to be found in the contemporary tombs of the Greek colonies at Chalkidiki, thus indicating not only a striking difference from Central Macedonia at that period, but also perhaps another cultural background. It seems that being buried with weapons was commonplace in that part of the Greek world and was not depicting the actual status of the dead during his lifetime. Rather, it was a depiction of how the dead would like to be seen in his tomb or would like to have been when alive. It has been argued that this must be true, for example, for the tomb Beta at Derveni, just outside modern Thessaloniki, where a man and a woman were cremated and were accompanied, among other vessels, with weapons. Funerals were occasions either of projecting personal and cultural identities or of creating new ones. These identities were outcomes or reflections of contemporary ideas, beliefs, or social structures, closely connected with claims, or perhaps even an ideology, about the status of the deceased. It was a symbolic ritual, closely connected with a certain kind of masculine ideal. Apart from the important social status it was implying for the dead, burial with weapons meant that the deceased was part of a nexus combining masculinity, bravery in battle, and political authority, a kind of big man in these societies. But these identities were not uniform. Since regionalism seems to be the most striking feature of the so-called Dark Ages, one should not make general assumptions regarding the whole of the Macedonian mainland. Material diversity goes along with social diversity, and there were many Dark Age societies instead of one. For example, societies developed along different lines. In other words, one cannot speak of a uniform Homeric society as far as Macedonia in that period was concerned. This lack of uniformity is depicted in the regional patterns in pottery, the different burial customs, and settlement structure. All these differences made some researchers suggest that the Bronze Age societies were considerably fragile as far as their political structures were concerned, since they depended on the big man and his abilities as a leader. One of the main features of such societies is the investment in display. And it seems that the symposium was such a place where the big man would or could advertise his powers. So, cemeteries are a usually flattering, indirect representation of society, which tells us much more about the collective habits and material values of particular societies. In stable settlements, the grave plots, that is a group of graves that probably represent the burial area of a particular bearing group, may suggest a notion of continuity that was not depending on the notion of a big man. We have argued elsewhere that the burial customs in the Eastern cemetery at Archondiko, here, just next to Pella, which is dated to the period after the conquest of Botea by the Macedonians, that is in the second half of the 7th or the early 6th century, seem to share the same material culture as those at other sites of Central Macedonia. We say seem because, notwithstanding these similarities, they are different from many other burial sites in Central Macedonia, possibly a reflection of the multi-ethnic character of the kingdom already in the early stages. And although it has been suggested that at Vergina in particular, the evidence of wealth as well as the number of graves seems to decline after 700-650 BC, recent excavations have altered the picture dramatically. In the male burials of the Iron Age Tumuli cemetery at Vergina, we find daggers and swords. Also, symbolic vessels were found in the Macedonian cemeteries from both Vergina and Archondiko, and also Synthos. Also at Vergina, although none of the burials from the Archaic cemetery has been fully published, one can see similarities with the Eastern cemetery of Archondiko, since drinking equipment has a strong presence among the grave goods. Although it mainly consists of clay vessels, either imported or local, with the wealthier finds to be limited in a few bronze fiale, inochoe, and lecanide, one cannot exclude the possibility that other, more precious artifacts could have existed simultaneously, given the fact that these graves were ruthlessly looted. Regardless of the possible connection of these wealthy graves with the Macedonian royal family, with the so-called Lady of Aegean being the most spectacular example, these archaic burials suggest a stratification in society analogous to the societies of other settlements in the wider area. At Synthos, 24 of the 35 unlooted graves of the archaic period have yielded symbolic vases, differing in number per grave. 7 of these 25 graves belong to men, women, and children, and are strikingly different from the rest regarding the quantity and quality not only of the metal drinking vessels, but also of the other offerings. Symbolic equipment, also identical to those found at Vergina and Archondiko, is also attested in some archaic burial sites to the east of the Axios River, reaching up to the Anthemus Valley. Particularly remarkable is also the realization that the mortuary practices at Synthos are the same with those attested at Vergina and Archondiko. The interpretation of these similarities between the various sites mentioned earlier and the Macedonian cemeteries is not firmly agreed to date. A first suggestion could be that these similarities were due to the existence of a Mycenaean substratum or the memories of the Mycenaean burial customs. To give an example, similarities in burials from Vergina, Archondiko, Synthos, or even more inland Eani, and offerings could perhaps imply that Macedonia was inhabited by Mycenaeans who had emigrated in the region after the collapse of the Mycenaean world in the Peloponnese and elsewhere, and their contacts with the indigenous populations may have resulted in mixed cultural schemes. Still, the above do not imply the rather discredited assumption that changes in material culture signify changes in population. Snodgrass thought of Macedonia as a special category regarding the so-called Dark Ages. Its indigenous culture was affected by a shallow Mycenaean element, but the remoteness of the country and a major wave of non-Greek settlers which arrived at the end of the Bronze Age were the key factors for the particular character Macedonia had. A second and stronger suggestion would be that since, as Catherine Morgan has put it, I quote, ethnic expression requires a political framework, end of the quote, this framework was the Macedonian state itself, having already expanded up to the Anthemus area by the end of the 6th century. Some scholars believe that the first expansion of the kingdom to the east of Axios took place somewhere around 510-505 BC, shortly after the region was conquered by the Persians. Others place this event not long before the arrival of the Persians, or even soon after their departure. The suggestions that the Macedonians advanced deep into these areas already during Amyntas I's reign, second half of the 6th century until circa 500, is fascinating. Eugene Borgia, for example, takes it for granted that Anthemus was part of Amyntas' realm, a recent acquisition together with the regions of Mygdonia and Christonia. In an effort to answer the question posed above, the reconstruction of the history of Macedonia in the 6th century and of the possible Macedonian expansion in the areas east of the Axios River is decisive. It is likely that Anthemus was part of the Macedonian kingdom when offered to the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias by the Macedonian king Amyntas in 505 BC, apparently with Persian approval, since the area east of the Axios up to Anthemus must have been annexed to Macedonia before 480. This offer of Anthemus to Hippias cannot be explained otherwise. By this, we mean that the Macedonians, having reached the western bank of Axios River already in an early period, perhaps in the middle of the 6th century, had expanded their political territory also to the immediate regions east of the river, that is, Amphixitis, a part of Mygdonia, and Anthemus. Macedonian expansion towards Anthemus seems to be confirmed by archaeological data via the similarities of funerary customs mentioned above. To this assumption leads also the information provided by Cathy Morgan in a quite recent paper regarding the excavations conducted by the British Salonika force in 1916-1918 at the Agios Vasilios Lake region in Mygdonia. This is the first lake found here. Dating by Morgan to the early 5th century, these graves contained the conspicuous wealth of personal ornament and weapons, nowadays familiar from many cemeteries in the wider area of Thessaloniki. The contents of grave 2 are reported as a spearhead, 2 spear butts rusted together, and a knife, all of iron. Morgan noted that similar, though rare, finds are made in Archaic Macedonia from high-status graves at Vergina and from Syndos from 560 BC onwards. Some counter-arguments could be raised, however. For example, in 505 BC, Amintas did not have the full jurisdiction of his realm due to Macedonia's vassal status to Persia. 2. The political expansion of the Macedonians east of the Axios River cannot be confirmed by archaeology. 3. The Agios Vasilios Lake lies significantly further east. Yet, the mortuary practices which are similar and were attested above are hard to ignore. Therefore, I propose that these similarities indicate not only a common cultural environment, regardless of the inhabitants' ethnic identity, that is, regardless of the fact if they were Thracians, Macedonians, Illyrians, or whatever, or Greeks from the south. And the issue, one must say, is extremely complicated, as the area was inhabited by various tribes. The areas of Anthemus and Aphaxitis up to the Agios Vasilios Lake, I believe, were the frontier of the Macedonian expansion during Amintas' reign. A territorial expansion further to the eastern parts of Mygdonia is unlikely to have happened. Archaeological evidence does not indicate a strong Macedonian presence in that region, as well as in Bisaltia, before 480 BC. It is possible to trace the identities of those buried at the cemeteries found in all these places. Is it possible to trace the identities of those buried at the cemeteries found in all these places? Regarding identity, I believe that labeling material traits as ethnic is tempting, but it's also dangerous. It must be noted here that one cannot be certain about the ethnic identity of the indigenous inhabitants in those areas during the 6th century. It has been suggested, however, recently that the possibility of the dead at Archondiko and in the areas east of the Axios River, the possibility to be simply a Macedonian aristocrats is excluded on the basis that this burial custom does not appear in the Macedonian royal cemetery at Aegean. I believe that to perceive these dead as merely local rulers is just a guess, since there are some objections to this suggestion. The main one is that it's not safe to speak of Greeks from southern Greece, Macedonians, Votiaeans, or Thracians in these regions, based, as I said, exclusively on archaeological material. Still, one cannot overlook the way the various different territories of action add up to the political territory of a community. And especially when this community is defined as an ethnos, as was the case with the ancient Macedonians. And last but not least, as already known from the seminal work of Frederick Barth, ethnic groups are defined by categories of ascription and identification by the actors themselves. Therefore, the existence of variations in the burials at all the cemeteries mentioned above may be considered as variations within the leading group, that is, the victorious Macedonian aristocrats. How all these actually are related to change? how can one say that there was a change of identity in all these places and all those people living before and after the Macedonian conquest are there? Were they, some of them, left, or were they, all of them, exterminated or expelled? I will use only two examples, not only for reasons of time sparing, but also because there are no other examples in our sources. The first is Almopia. As already mentioned, the Macedonians expelled the other tribes in the region, that is the Edonians and the Eordi, from Mygdonia and Eordea respectively, to the east. The former resettled beyond the river Strymon, while those who survived the Macedonian conquest were settled near Fiska in Mygdonia. Almopia was next, the ancient inhabitants of which, according to Thucydides, were forced to leave their ancestral homes and move to other areas. Neither the historian nor any other literary source up to the late antiquity defines the new resettlement location. What's more, in his narrative of the Persian forces invading Greece in 480, Herodotus mentions all those tribes who had forcibly or not joined the advancing Persian army. He refers to almost every tribe expelled by the Macedonians in the period of the expansion, that is, the Paeonians, the Eordi, the Votiae, the local Chalcidians, the Phrygians, the Pierians, even to the Macedonians themselves, but there is not a word of the Almopians. Their absence from Herodotus' passage, combined with information derived by Thucydides, are, in my opinion, indirect signs of the full political integration of the Almopians in the Macedonian state. The residents of Almopia were, either willingly or not, incorporated into the Macedonian kingdom and were thus considered as Macedonians in the political sense, that is, as subjects of the Macedonian king. Therefore, Herodotus must have included them within the term Makedones he used in the passage just mentioned above. Perhaps one could apply in this case Robin Osborne's suggestion that throughout the Archaic period, I quote, the sense of belonging to a people, ethnos, who inhabited the whole region was throughout the Archaic period as strong as the sense of belonging to a particular community determined to be distinguished from its neighbors. Maybe this was the case for the Almopians, as the circumstances in these first stages of the Macedonian expansion in the so-called Lower Macedonia were different from those regarding Upper Macedonia almost 2 centuries later. Almopia was a region inhabited by autonomous, either pre-Greek, Greek, or not Greek group before the Macedonian conquest. The identity of this group must have changed due to the historical circumstances. As noted, one cannot possibly know whether there had been also changes in the social context and whether the Almopians were differentiating themselves from their conquerors. For the Macedonians, Almopia was a spear-won land. The existence of what we call warrior graves of the 6th century in Almopia implies perhaps the foreign Macedonian origin of the deceased, but it certainly shows the different status of the dead in the local society. So there were mainly social and not ethnic differentiations, strengthened by the very existence of other, smaller and poorer in grave goods burials. The case of the Almopians is a fine example, I think, of a new notion of collective identity that emerged through the Macedonian expansion in the early Iron Age, an identity going beyond the ideas of ethnicity. The second example are the inhabitants of Votiae, who were expelled from their ancestral region and, by Thucydides' times, were dwelling next to the Chalcidians in the Chalkidiki Peninsula. The Votiaeans moved to Chalkidiki and settled in the area north of Potidea in the 7th century BC. This area was called Votiki and was located to the southeast of Chrysis. You can see it here. The name was derived from the ethnic name Votieos, but the new place took the name Votiki in order to be distinguished from Votiea, and also to imply, of course, that it was a region inhabited by the expelled Votians. Those Votians in Chalkidiki developed a new, different identity. Except for the name of their new dwellings, Votiki, they seem to have emphasized the Polish culture. Could this have been a result of being neighbors to the Greek colonists coming from the south? Perhaps. The ethnic Photiaeon on their coins meant a new civic and perhaps ethnic Photian identity constructed in a new political environment. Or perhaps it implied a normal political evolution to another stage of political existence. This new stage was influenced by the interaction with the Greek settlers and the Polish culture they were bringing with them. So, to conclude, one could suggest that the violence exercised by the Macedonians upon the Almopians, the Photians, and all others residing in those areas, led to a series of events which depict the efforts made by the defeated to cope with the new circumstances. War, defeat, expulsion, resettlement, creation and projection of a new identity, a new political culture, and constructions of memory. On the other hand, the challenge Macedonians faced was to impose, rather to enforce, their authority upon all other tribes located in the region. They achieved this by expelling most of the existing population from the area. And since an ethnic group is more than just a social unit with distinctive traits and origins, we can suppose that the Macedonians who had conquered all these places and belonged to the elite were compelled, in a way, to demonstrate their status in the new lands and to ensure their prominence in them after the violent expulsions they had conducted. One could assume also that the victorious Macedonians had to deal with the costs of exercising their power, costs associated with the impact of their violent expansion. But in this case too, the evidence is absent. Still, those Macedonians had created during this stage of their expansion a political framework visible in the 5th century by Thucydides, who named the tribes of Upper Macedonia as allied to and subjugated by the Macedonians, thus depicting the surviving variations of political status inside the Macedonian kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Ioannis, for tackling such a difficult subject, a subject made difficult by the dearth of evidence pointing to a narrative, as you yourself mentioned. Questions or comments? I already see one. Kostas, can you?
Hi again. So my question is about the identities and tombs. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we usually interpret the magnitude of a tomb, especially a great example is the Athenian Keramikos, that the magnitude is used to show off the wealth of the deceased and in the extent of his family. Of course, we have a different kind of burial in the Athenian Keramikos than the Macedonian tombs, but I was wondering if we can suggest something like that, that the tomb is also used.
I've lost you.
Also,
I'm sorry, I've lost your question. If the tomb can be used, you said, yes?
The magnitude and χαρακτηρίσματα, συγγνώμη.
I'm not sure I heard the question, the full question, but first of all, we are talking about different periods. Those tombs at Keramikos also refer to another political context. What I tried to imply in my paper was that the victorious Macedonians, as I said, were somehow compelled to project their elite status, mainly social status. due to time limitations, I couldn't present the finds from the different cemeteries in detail. But there are different burial customs. These different burial customs surely imply different social status of the dead, not necessarily a different ethnic origin. So my point is that, and of course, the main thing is that those cemeteries with warrior graves, the so-called warrior graves, are found in places where the Macedonians must have fought during their expansion. And they wanted something to remember, to commemorate their victory. All those, I believe, all those who were part of this enterprise, this expansion enterprise, were actually proud for their participation in that. And those buried with their weapons either were themselves warriors or wanted to be remembered as warriors. That's the case. And the change that happened in the populations around the Thermaic Gulf was, at least according to the two examples that I gave, was radical. The Almopians just vanish from history. We do have the ethnic name Almopios, but it's also together with the ethnic name Macedon in later, very later inscriptions. While the Votians have a new political entity in the Chalkidiki Peninsula. So I believe that one cannot make a comparison with Athens, where kingship was just something very, very old to be remembered.
Can I ask one more?
Since there is no other, as I can see, I assume.
Okay, thank you. How can you distinguish whether or not the person who died is warrior or wants to be remembered as one? How can you tell?
You can't.
Oh, okay.
You can't. It's merely a guess. I mean, we can't. I mean, in some cases, the bones have fractions or indications of someone who died in battle. But this is first, not all tombs have been examined. I mean, the anthropological remains are not still examined thoroughly. And two, we do have cases where the deceased was quite old in order to be a warrior in his lifetime. I mean, to have died as a warrior. But it's just that difficult. You can't tell if the deceased was really a warrior or wanted to be depicted as one.
Okay.
Question by Thomas Clemens.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting paper. I really enjoyed it. I know very little about Macedon, so I apologize if this comes across as very ignorant. But it seems to me that we have this problem of regional expansion in several regions in the ancient Aegean. And if we were trying to use some etic concepts to further understand how these communities extend their power or their authority, or whatever term you want to use. So the kind of etic question I would like to ask of you is, as the Macedonians are expanding their influence over these different communities in the early Iron Age and the Archaic period, if I have understood your argument correctly, should we primarily think of them as extending a jurisdiction over persons or over land, or is that not a distinction that is analytically useful? That would be my question.
Thank you. Actually, we don't have any sources on that. So I believe that their political authority was over lands. And it's difficult for me to believe or to accept that all populations, all pre-existing populations were just eliminated. After all, if you are a winner, you must project your identity to those defeated. And hence were also and are always needed for other things that the warrior shouldn't or couldn't do. So I think it's over the lands, not only over persons. In that period, I believe that populations did not, in Macedonia, had not evolved to such a political status in order to be, I say, very energetic in their political lives.
We have any other questions or comments? I see a hand, not a digital hand, but an actual hand by Katerina. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you, Paschalis. Thank you, Yanni, for pointing out the differences between the Macedonians and other populations in this very interesting presentation. I would just like to clarify the way in which the Macedonians perceive themselves at this time. It is quite remarkable that, you know, warriors have to be buried with their weapons. And that means that, you know, weapons cannot be transmitted to their family members, more or less. So, and that actually changes over time, doesn't it?
With the exception of shields, weapons are buried with the dead. They are not transmitted to the next generation. Only the shields seem to be transmitted because, first, we have no shields. I think there's only one case in all those cemeteries. And I assume that it was something very expensive to be buried with the dead. So, but the rest of the weapons seem to belong to the deceased.
As the defensive weapons are transmitted, whereas...
And defensive also, not the defensive weapons in general, just the shields.
Okay, Macedonians are reputed as Argyraspides in later comments, but it's interesting to see how they perceive themselves, more or less.
Katerina, it would be wonderful to have a source on how the Macedonians perceive themselves, but it's too early. And all information we have comes from later authors, and as I said, it's subject to critique. Therefore, you cannot tell how the Macedonian felt about himself. I tend to believe, after many years of dealing with the Macedonians, that they just didn't care about their own self-perception. They were what they were. They were Macedonians. All other explanations and perceptions are later constructions. So at this very first stage, I think they were just the Macedonians who had won, just like that.
If I may take up the point that Ioannis just made, the very fact that the sources we have about some sort of ethnic narrative is invariably later. I mean, I think it was Peter Rhodes who counted narratives about the history of Macedonia, not history of the Macedonian kings. And I think the number is no more than 13 works, most of which belong to the imperial period.
Exactly.
Or to the late, or to the Republican period, in any case, after the demise of the kingdom. So as far as the narratives for ethnic identities in the ancient world in general is concerned, it is very interesting to find an ethnic narrative after the demise of a political community. So, but that's a completely different topic.
if I may just follow up on this, I mean, it's quite interesting that, you know, you do get shields depicted on tombs later, in later periods. The Lefkadia tomb the tomb of Lyson and Kalliklis is a case of a tomb where shields are depicted on the in beautiful paintings in the tomb, but that is again later. I mean, even in archaeology, you find that type of evidence quite later.
Exactly.
I see a written question, a tiny point about shields. They are mostly made of wood, so don't survive unless they have metal attachments.
Yes, Hans is right. Still, archaeologists who have conducted excavations at Archontico and Synthos have not found any metal attachments. Therefore, they have reached the conclusion, I could say assumption, but they say conclusion, that there were no shields buried together with the dead. So it's all too, it's a misty environment, and one cannot tell with accuracy what exactly happened. That's why perhaps it's interesting.
Hand raised by Manuela Mari.
Hi, Ioannis. Nice to see you, although in this electronic form. No, just to come back to Thucydides, inevitably, you said correctly that we have very few sources and very few narratives and later narratives. I have the impression that many times this famous chapter in Thucydides was in some way overvalued or misinterpreted due to some inherent difficulties. I limit myself in quoting two difficulties in these famous passages. One is the fact that Thucydides combines a chronological order and a geographical order in his exposition. And it's not always easy to distinguish between them. So sometimes we attribute a chronological significance to something that it's only a topographical reference, so to say. This is one major difficulty. And the second one is about the meaning of the very word Macedones in this chapter, because we have apparently a double meaning. He says at a certain point something like Macedonon auton, that is Macedonians stricto sensu, so to say, just to distinguish the, so to say, original Macedonians from those who became Macedonians after the conquest. You make the example of the Almopians, but we probably have to extend this idea. I mean, the fact that Thucydides has apparently in mind two degrees of Macedonicity, so to say, that the Macedonians from the origins and those who became part of the Macedonian
king, yes. Those who were originating from the Macedonians themselves, οι Μακεδόνες αυτοί, and those who became Macedonians in the political sense, that is, subjects of the Macedonian king, and not necessarily originating from the Macedonians.
Exactly. And I have the impression that sometimes some misinterpretations of this passage were also originated by the fact that modern scholars didn't perceive exactly these nuances in Thucydides' chapter. This is my opinion, at least.
I just wanted to point out not the chronological sequence, but the variety of tribes, of ethnic, conquered by the Macedonians. And we don't have a single information. I mean, about the Almopians, Fritz Geyer had written just one sentence. Über die Almopien wissen wir nichts. Back in 1930. So, this said, I wanted to see if there is some evidence regarding their resettlement. The only evidence which I didn't refer to today, is an inscription found beyond the river Strymon, belonging to the 2nd century AD. Theas Almopias Ambelos. It's the inscription. But it's 8 centuries later. I mean, imagine an inscription of 1200 BC found today. Could this tell something? So I tried to figure out what happened to those populations, and combined with information from Herodotus in his narrative about Darius's campaign in 480, we find all the other tribes mentioned by Thucydides except for the Almopians. And this struck me, and I said, okay, maybe perhaps they were incorporated. I mean, as I said before, I cannot believe that they were just exterminated, all of them, because we have tombs in Almopia showing different burial customs than those found in other regions. That is, in the same time, in the same period. That is, perhaps some of them still existed in their original nucleus and were incorporated, and they were Macedonians in the political sense, as you said.
We have another question by Christos Yamakis.
Yeah, hello. I have a quick comment to make and a quick question to my former supervisor. The comment is about the shields. Professor Van Vies is probably right that the shields were wooden. However, both in Syndos and in Archodiko, we have found shields. And in both cases, they are made of bronze. So yeah. And the question to Professor Xydopoulos is that you mentioned the existence of a Mycenaean substratum as the possible explanation of the Macedonian burial rites in the 7th and the 6th centuries BC. So isn't that a bit late? I mean, there is a significant chronological gap. How can you explain this?
I didn't say that the Mycenaean substratum was a reason for the burial customs found in the water tombs. I said that this has been said in scholarship. This has been argued in scholarship. That is a possible explanation of the golden masks and other burial customs found in these tombs. I believe that perhaps there was a Mycenaean tradition followed by the original Macedonians, but this is just speculation. I cannot prove anything. Therefore, I think that this tradition went on and came down to depict the members of the elite, of the fighting elite, in a way similar to the Mycenaean dead. But this is something that cannot be proven, simply because of the lack of any other evidence. It's just a thought, not even a theory.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions or comments? No virtual hands, no actual hands.
Can I?
Yes.
Yanni, just to mention that in the first half of the first millennium, Assyria started conquering a large part of the Near East. And it conquered the area we nowadays call Syria, which was by the Arameans. Now, there's only one place in the world where the name of the Assyrians has survived, and that, of course, is Syria, the land of the Syrians, in a process which is truly fascinating, how the population that was conquered was the only area that retained the name of the conquerors. Just as a material for thought.
Okay, thank you, Kostas.
There are no more comments. I suppose we can conclude this session. I would like to thank you all. And we reconvene tomorrow. I don't remember the time. At 10:30, if I'm not mistaken.
10:30.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, sorry, Katerina.
May I just remind those speakers who haven't sent their declarations of consent to please send their papers, hopefully by Sunday if possible. I mean, I know that there's some people who have been.
Okay, thank you all, and we'll see each other tomorrow again. Good night.
Bye-bye.